All right, we are live. Joining me today, three extra special guests for our extra special 100th episode of Consciousness Live, Brownapalooza Extravaganza Spectacular. I think that's how you're supposed to say it. Anyway, joining me today this morning is Alex, Matthias, and David. Thanks, guys, for joining me. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, man. This is great.
And for having me on. Glad to be here. Very nice.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to have some interesting informal discussion. I'm going to start off just by saying a little bit about the themes of the book for people who may not be familiar. Yes, excellent. Thank you. It was a fun book to write, but it was also difficult. So I'm interested to hear what people think about it. And I have to say that I don't really know what you guys are going to be saying. I sort of know what the themes that we're going to be discussing are, but I'm very curious to hear what your guys' responses are. And for anyone listening, if there's any interesting comments or questions that come in, maybe we'll be able to get to them. So I wrote the book as someone who is interested in higher order theories of consciousness, but doesn't really see myself as a true believer of these kinds of theories. I sort of found myself in the position of finding them intuitively interesting, but I always found a bit of skeptical in myself with respect to specific versions of higher order theory, specifically higher order thought theories, which I always found to be very strange and surprising. So I spent a lot of time thinking about those kinds of theories, and I gradually came to convince myself that they aren't as strange as they seem, and they really have a very interesting way of presenting what consciousness is and how you should think of it. And there are different ways of putting this picture together. And I gradually came to realize that some of the ways of putting this picture together were more congenial to my background way of thinking, and other than were maybe more congenial to other people's way of thinking. So I thought, it's very interesting here, actually. There isn't one sort of thing called higher order theories. There's a whole family of these kinds of theories. And the kind of main commitment that people often thought was essential for these theories was labeled the transitivity principle, this idea that a conscious state is one that you are conscious of. And I found that always to be very somewhat surprising and not intuitive. And I found it odd that that was often associated as a kind of bedrock principle with the higher order theory. So I tried to spend a lot of time thinking about why that was and sorting them out. And I came to the idea that there's what I call the traditional higher order approach, which takes this idea that a conscious state is one that you're conscious of very seriously. And then there is what I call the non-traditional higher order approach, which instead focuses on the notion of inner awareness. And so that's the kind of way that I set out the difference between higher order theories and first order theories. I want to focus on the notion of awareness, the psychological notion of being aware of something, and then the way I see theories of consciousness as dividing as between those that think awareness of the world in some way is important, and those that think awareness of our own mental life is some way important. And so I think higher order theories can be classified as those that think inner awareness of one's own mind in some sense is essential in understanding phenomenal consciousness. So that's my big picture overview of the landscape. And then I want to explicitly draw a connection to representation, because I think that higher order theories were often told that they're representational theories, that people start off saying, oh, there's representational theories of consciousness, first order, higher order. And then once you start reading further into the details, higher order theories don't seem to be representational theories at all. Only in some general vague sense are they representational, like they appeal to thoughts or concepts or something. So I wanted to take seriously the idea that they are a kind of representational approach to consciousness, but from a distinctive point of view where inner awareness is playing an essential role, as opposed to first order awareness. It's a higher order awareness. But after that, you kind of take it seriously as a representational theory of consciousness. And so I see myself as differing from people like Papinaeu and Matthias here, who don't see representation in the way that I view it as essential for phenomenal consciousness, and instead think that it's first order states and they're being pointed at or activated in some way that is the relevant thing, but still see a role for inner awareness. It's just that the inner awareness that they postulate doesn't have the kind of representational structure that the view that I'm interested in has. Although I do think there are elements there, so that my own view is that if you had a just a pointer pointing at a first order state, that would amount to what Matthias has called blank access, what I would call phenomenally silent content. It would allow the pointed to state to become activated, control behavior, funneled into working memory, but it wouldn't result in there being something it's like from your point of view. So because the relevant kind of representation would be missing on the kind of view I defend. And I also think that for critics of representationalism like David here, their arguments are often aimed at first order theories of representation. And I think that we can get around some of these arguments by appealing to higher order representations. This is not to say that I think that these theories are correct. It's just that I think they're interesting and they have a way of putting together this stuff that hasn't been explored too much. Because a lot of people have been focused on the transitivity principle and the versions of higher order theory that I call the traditional higher order theories, which are interesting and worth exploring. I just think there's been a whole other kind of camp that hasn't been explored yet. And so I think that the main difference between my way of thinking of things and the more traditional view is that I recognize that there's a kind of non-relational content that's important for consciousness, but I think also in contradistinction of those guys and people like Alex, that there's got to be some kind of relational aspect as well in order to secure the content that you're picking out, but that relation is not going to play a role in phenomenal consciousness. It's going to play a role in securing a functional, greasing the wheels of access, so to speak, allowing the first order states to enter into the relevant range. So there's a lot going on here, a lot for us to discuss. These are some of the themes that as I see them coming up. So in particular here, themes of representation, themes of transparency, whether it is we are aware of our own mental life or whether we're aware only of things out in the external world, and questions about whether we need some kind of relational aspect to our content in order to provide the notion of mental function that we're interested in, or whether we can have a purely non-relational, non-referential semantics. So those are some of the themes that I think we'll be thinking of today. And I'll turn it over to you guys. Someone is saying in the chat that there's an echo. Is that echo still present, I wonder?
No echo here.
Same.
I'm clear.
Okay.
Yep. Testing.
Oops. Hold on, someone is, so maybe there's an echo on my end, someone is saying. So I think I can take that. Is the echo gone now? I think it should be gone. Okay. Let me know if there's still an echo. I think Tom Clark was saying is that there was an echo, and also Jamie. Okay, go ahead, guys. So I'll turn it over to you guys while I try to figure out what's going on with the echo.
Okay. Well, thanks, Richard. I very much enjoyed reading the book. Should I start formulating my first question?
Yes.
Okay. So I had a question about the format of the higher order representations you're postulating. There's a sense in which they have dual content. So the first part is a pointer to your own representational state. And essentially, the whole content is, I am in that representational state with accuracy conditions that would be fulfilled if I were seeing, say, perceptible red or something like that.
Yes.
And the format you say is conceptual and or symbolic, as opposed to iconic or anything, something like that. And it seems to me that that's going to grant you a bit too much freedom in what conscious states can represent. So usually, symbolic symbols are freely recombinable in general. So why can't you have, representations that say I'm seeing red or blue, or red and not a horse, or I don't know, where is it that you can't represent all those things perceptually or consciously that you could represent in principle with symbols. And then, as a kind of corollary of this, you also get maybe we can also go into the more standard objections to why conscious perception is not usually taken to be symbolic in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. All right, so this is a very good place for us to start. And hopefully, please keep, if there's any sort of echo, which I think it was because I had two mics on in my audio, but one of them is off now. So hopefully I turn the right one off. But anyway, so I think that one way to start talking about this, Matthias, is to distinguish the kinds of view that I have from the more traditional, and the reason why I don't want to think of myself as a higher order thought theorist, and that's why I think of myself as a higher order representationalist, and why I have the horror theory instead of a type of hot theory. And that's because I don't think of these concepts that we're using as the ordinary concepts that apply, that you could call up in your stream of thought, so to speak, your ordinary thinking when you're just sitting around having thoughts, namely mental states with assoteric force of an intentional content, blah, blah. So I don't think you can just have any kind of concept show up in these higher order representations that we are postulating here. And so they are thought-like in the sense that I think that they have an intentional content, whereby they have an accuracy condition that allows you to say what they're sort of talking about, so to speak, or what picture they're describing to the subject. But I don't think you would expect there to be such a thing as disjunctive or just any kind of logical operation or just any intentional content to show up, so that these concepts are going to be specialized. And the way I think of these things is that they probably are going to show up in a specialized module, or they're going to be specialized concepts which are used only in these relevant kinds of higher order representations. Now, I mean, that's an empirical claim and speculative, obviously, but so I would want to very clearly distinguish. I think that would be like more of a pressing objection to a standard higher order thought theory that said these are folk psychological thoughts, they're just kind of automatic and you implicitly apply them yourself over time. And I've always found that to be a little bit hard to reconcile because of the things you're talking about.
Just a quick follow-up. It's still the case that when I use the concept perceptible red that I use in my horror in the higher order representation, that concept is the same concept I use when I talk about red things. So for example, imagine like Mary wonders what is it like to be red from inside the black and white room.
Mm-hmm.
When she comes out of the room, is the concept that is used in her experience, so to speak, as the vehicle of her experience, the same concept as the concept she used before?
No.
Okay.
So I
So she
think,
acquires a new concept of perceptible red that is
yes.
not the concept of perceptible red that I use, when I talk about red abstractly. So there are two concepts of perceptible red.
So there's the public concept, I guess I would say, whereby we all kind of are trying to pick out the thing that we think objects in the world have, the redness, which is perceptible red. I think naively that's what we think. But there is the phenomenal concept, which can only be acquired by having the experience directly, and which so that before you have it, this is why my response. By the way, this is sort of going too far afield for me. But this is why my kind of take on the Mary argument is not the ability hypothesis or the phenomenal concept strategy even, but rather instead what I think is that if she had the right concept, she would know a priori. She just doesn't have the right concept in her room. So she has to have experience to get the concept. But that doesn't show that she couldn't have known a priori had she had the concept. So I just think that this is an interesting case where you only get the concept by having the experience, but it's
Yeah, okay.
Right.
So that's why she can formulate thoughts like this red surface could have felt greenish, for example,
yes.
because she has two kinds of concepts.
Well, I mean, I thought this was kind of an ordinary thing that people say, that there's the public concept and then there's the phenomenal concept, and I don't want to deny that there is the phenomenal concept, that the direct, kind of in the Chalmers terminology, direct phenomenal concepts. I think
I'm feeling a bit puzzled here, but maybe it's because I'm ignorant. I haven't thought these issues through enough. But I read this book as, at first pass, being representationalist in the standard naturalist representationalist style of Ty and Dretske and Harman and Lycan and so on. And it's not obvious to me that when they first think about perceptual states representing the world, that they have concepts in play. They just have worldly properties in play. Transparency tells you that the properties in your experience are the same properties as physical objects can have.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're in your experience represents the world in front of you to instantiate those properties. And it's not clear that concepts are coming in yet. We've just got the properties. And I took it that you were in that ballpark. I mean, you didn't have worldly properties because you've moved in the kind of Dave Chalmers Edenic direction, but there's still properties that, as it happens, no objects have, but in property space, they're perfectly good properties. And you think of them as in the experience, and that's why the experience represents. Now, I mean, at this point, I'm just attributing to you a view that's not particularly explicit in the book, and I want to check that is your view at first pass. Then we could think about what's that got to do with Mary and two kinds of concepts of these properties. But I mean, is that your view?
I don't think that that's my view. Yeah. So
help me.
so I think of the Ty and the Dretske style of representationalism, which, so you could have a higher order version of, and you could have like a kind of non-conceptual higher order representationalism. But I think that there's got to be some kind of concept or intentional content, something like that, because it has these kinds of accuracy conditions. And this is, I guess, in a way where we disagree about this kind of stuff, David. But I think if it has these kind of accuracy conditions, you would call it a concept, because the role that it's playing is the role that concepts play. So, I mean, maybe it's a special kind of concept. Maybe you don't want to call it that. I don't know. But I would say that it is the kind of thing which has those kinds of properties and which could compose, so that I sort of feel that there's versions of the higher order representation view where if you think I am seeing red, then you could have the I am seeing part disconnect and replace the red with green, and then I am seeing green would be there. So I do think they're kind of compositional in a sense and have components. And
I'm feeling a bit discombobulated because I never really thought about what Ty and Dretske, when there being this kind of straightforward transparency representationalists, will think about the Mary case, because it's the properties themselves that are serving as the concepts in the perceptual states. And I take it they could serve as concepts in higher order representational states. But where do they get two concepts of the same thing then? I'm not quite sure what they'd say. I mean,
yeah, so this is in...
Anybody help me? Does anybody remember anything from the literature? I mean, Michael Ty certainly traded in phenomenal concepts, not so much anymore, but he used to. I can't remember how it goes.
Same.
Let me say, I find the standard, what I'm calling standard representationalism, so weird that until I started working in this area, it never crossed my mind that anybody believed it. And so when I used to read Michael Ty on problems and so on back in 20 years ago, I didn't worry about how he put it together with his transparency representationalism, because, as I said, I couldn't believe anybody thought that. But yeah.
Well, so I'm not sure what's the problem exactly.
No, I didn't have a problem.
Okay.
I just got puzzled myself about putting together the phenomenal concept story about Mary with orthodox transparency representationalism. Maybe we should put that to one side. And if nobody else has got this puzzle, it's not for me to...
Yeah, well, I think their standard view is that it's an ability thing, that she learns how to identify the thing in a new way, but doesn't acquire a new concept.
Okay.
But I think that the kind of central question about that sometimes divides people about the Mary question is whether she learns new information. And so I think that those standard first order representationalists say no.
Let's put Mary to one side. I wanted to press you a bit on the representationalism and your dismissal of the idea that the higher order states represents the first order state as having a mental quality. And it seems to me that your whole story will work much better with that because of the difficulties I have having perceptual states constituted by involving perceptible properties. And I mean, maybe, and let me just run through the line of argument I have in my book on sensory experience, which is, it's a pretty weird kind of constitution for perceptual states that they involve a relation to what in many cases is an uninstantiated property. I mean, it's all the hallucinations and illusions. And once you bring in Edenic properties, your perceptible properties, it looks like they're always going to be uninstantiated. So we've got a subject with a vehicle maybe that's related to an uninstantiated property. And I argue in the book that A, it just looks weird, and B, it's not clear how states so constituted can enter into causal relations. It's one thing for the property of red to be instantiated in some first order object, and then that's a fact and it can enter into causal relations. But the property I have of being related to the property redness in Plato's space, when the property redness isn't instantiated anywhere, doesn't look like the kind of thing that can enter into causal relations. And I mean, it's not something that comes up in the book, but I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. I mean, you've got these. I mean, when we have the mismatch case where the higher order state involves a relation to the property greenness, the first order state involves a relation to the property redness. It only accentuates the fact that the greenness isn't instantiated anywhere. So, I mean, well, in fact, it's never instantiated.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I agree with all that. So,
Yeah.
so I think that the one question is whether the first order states are representational. So whether the so-called mental qualities exist, or whether the first order states are representational in the sense of Tai and Dretske and those guys.
Right.
And I kind of am neutral on that question. I think you could go either way. So if you don't like these uninstantiated properties and they are an issue for you, then I think that you could, I think a quality space or mental quality
Good.
kind of story could work perfectly well for the first order states. And
Good.
those states are going to be largely in the way I think of things in control of behavior. They're psychologically real. They're important.
Good.
Now, how are you aware of those states? Well, I say that you're aware of those states as being primitive Edenic properties, which you confusingly, in a sense, represent mentally encountering this Edenic property in the world. And that's like an impossible thing. It can't really happen, but that's how you represent what's going on at the first order level. You represent yourself as encountering this Edenic property. And so that's what you experience. What it's like for you is like encountering the first order property. And that thing doesn't have to enter into any causal relations because all the work is done by the first order states, which are causally relevant and can be mental quality, but they, in my terminology, will be phenomenally silent. They don't show up in the what's phenomenologically manifest to the subject. They're under the hood, so to speak. And they would be in a kind of, the same way that the first order representationalists think about reflectance properties of the object in the world. It just moved into the mind. So I think that those properties at the first order level, you're misrepresenting them in a way all the time. And if you describe, and if you had the concept of mental red occurring in the higher order representation, according to me, then what it would be like for you would be like being aware of mental red, but that's manifestly not what it's like. And that's why almost everyone thinks transparency is an objection to higher order theories when it really isn't when you construe it the right way, because they say things like, I'm not aware of any mental qualities. And we say, no, that's phenomenologically not what's manifest. I agree. But that doesn't show that you're not aware of something that is a mental quality and that what you're doing is representing it in a strange way.
It's all complicated. I agree there's a sense in which when you introspect your phenomenal states, it seems to you that they're presenting you with an external world and so on. I think when one goes through it all very carefully, the way it seems to you, if you're taking introspection to be reliable and accurate, is a mistake. It's an illusion, and what you're actually aware of are dumb mental qualities. That's a line I take, but
I disagree with that.
I'm going to shut up in a second. I mean, but let me just ask one question. You said early on that you didn't like mental qualities because we don't think we have an everyday concept. We don't have any way of referring to them. And then you said you're going to come back to that in chapter 7, and I went and looked quite hard, and I couldn't find where you came back to it. So I'm still curious about, what's your is that your main objection to bringing in mental qualities here, that we don't have a standard everyday way of thinking about them?
So what I think is that well, it's complicated, first of all. So mental qualities are, if what we're talking about is what's phenomenologically manifest, which in my terminology means like what's in your stream of consciousness, like which properties and things do you think you are experiencing? Can you now, if we're talking about mental qualities in that sense, then my argument against them is that they can't play the role that is postulated without being basically first order properties, having the phenomenal aspect independently of the inner awareness. Which, if that's your view, that's fine, and I have no real problems with first order theories. If that's where you're starting out to go. But if you're trying to defend the higher order theory, and what you're saying is, oh, the mental qualities are this way, and then you become aware of them, and those mental qualities are now phenomenologically manifest, then that's my argument, is that that's unexplained magic, and or else collapses into the first order theory. So that's really what the argument of chapter 7 is supposed to be about, is like, we don't really have any way of understanding how it is that just pointing at a mental quality could light it up or make it phenomenologically manifest. I just don't understand what that would mean. It's the equivalent of thinking that in the world there are reflectance properties that are not qualitative until you are aware of them, and then suddenly qualitatively they're there, and it's like, that doesn't
Okay.
I can't understand that. So that was what that argument was supposed to be aimed at.
And I agree that nothing in the position I have in mind is going to tell you why just these things should light up.
Yeah.
I would hope that we're not looking for any theory of consciousness is going to do that. And if we had more time, I'd come back and challenge you on why you think your theory does that. But let's leave that for now. Maybe we'll come back to this later. Alex has been sitting quiet for a long time.
Okay.
Thanks for the prompt. Well, I've been thinking about this in the background as you guys have been discussing. I guess, yeah. So I'm not sure if I see. I think it's okay. The question that I clearly don't have an answer for myself right now is if the sort of format of the higher order representation is the same kind of thing that we use in just casual thought. That, I mean, basically, Matthias, your question at the outset, then why don't we have this unbounded representational capacity? So I think, Richard, I mean, my understanding was you don't necessarily, I think you said this already, but you don't necessarily take the horrors to be they might be something in a module, or they might be a special kind of representation.
Yeah.
I guess I resist that idea. So there's a lot I could say about representation. I think probably my presuppositions are quite different from maybe the average person in the room. So maybe we'll get to that. But one thing that seems true to me is that, so let's suppose that a high order theory is true. So then most of what I'm aware, like actually all of what I'm aware of, is a result of whatever kinds of representations are tokened in these higher order, the higher order representations, right? Like, there might be scientific or other reasons to posit other sorts of representations, but my mental life, including my awareness of the external world, is going to be mediated by this form of representation. So to me, okay, it could still be something, sorry, my phone is ringing on my computer. It could be something modular, but it's a pretty damn important module. It's going to be sort of, this is going to be the representational space. You know, I tend to think of these as like vector spaces, in which my experience of the world and of myself lives. So then it's almost like understanding what a ordinary conceptual thought that's not of that kind is more difficult, right? That becomes the problem. So I'm not sure exactly if I had a.
Well, I don't think of these as ordinary conceptual thoughts. I think of them as, in a way, thought-like, in the sense that they are employing concepts, but in particular in the sense that these concepts have accuracy conditions, which are something like sentence sized. So that's but that's not to say that they are ordinary, that you can actually cash them out. I mean, if I put all my cards on the table, I am a kind of old school language of thought type person who really does kind of think there is a language of thought, and that probably these higher order representations are going to be written in that a very specific language of thought, specific to this distributed kind of module, employing these very specific kinds of concepts, some of which are innate in my view, and some of which are acquired from the awareness of the first order states that you have in various other ways. But anyway, so I do think that that's an important component of what's going on. But anyway, sorry, I got distracted with what I was just. I went off on a tangent. Sorry, Alex.
No, not at all. Well,
But my point though is that I don't think that the concepts that like of perceptible red in the sense that I mean it, of this Edenic property, is the kind of thing that you can just sit around and think about, like when you're wondering, like, what is Edenic red like? The thought that you have, what is Edenic red like? Employing that concept is not the same as what's going to be employed in the very specific higher order representation, which is the phenomenally conscious state, according to me. It's just going to have some concept-like property. That's why I say it's thought-like. I don't think of them as thoughts. They're thought-like in the sense that you can assign them basically truth conditions in a sense, so their accuracy conditions kind of look like truth conditions, like the sense that they'll be accurate when you are in fact seeing red.
So if I could just follow up briefly, I think so I think I have a very minimal view of all this stuff. I guess it seems to me that whatever representation is responsible for my phenomenal consciousness, I mean, in a sense, this is going to be sort of the central hub of what I do as a conscious agent. So like when I talk about what I'm seeing, for example, those sentences express what's in that sort of representational space. And so I'm not sure. I guess where I'm heading is.
Well, I wouldn't say that automatically right off the bat, since often when you talk about what you're seeing, you're talking about stuff out there.
Sorry. Yeah. I guess the emphasis was on the I am seeing part. When I talk about myself as seeing something, right? And that's or I won't say introspectively, and that's based in my experience. Mm-hmm. I'm expressing a thought about myself, seeing something, and the something might be out in the world, probably usually is, but the I see part refers to myself seeing, and I'm aware of that in an inner way. I mean, I agree. I basically, I endorse. I believe in something. I'm Bayesian, so I don't have any beliefs, but I believe in,
You creed.
Like book. I distribute my credences, but
we don't like Bayesianism here, by the way. So just so you know.
Oh gosh, we should get. That sounds like too much of a tangent to dive into, but
okay.
I vote for Bayesianism.
You do?
All right.
Bummer.
Good.
Yeah, it's too bad. Frequentism.
I think frequentism is a special case, but anyway, I guess, so I have this problem that, Matthias, that you brought up, which is, I guess I sort of want to think of whatever's going on in higher order thoughts or horrors as the main sort of show. Like this is the thing that drives most of my, like there might be some other space of like thoughts that's we need for some special purpose, but to me that's it seems like this space of higher order representations that's responsible for phenomenal consciousness should be the one that, there might be other intervening layers of various things if you're like expressing a thought in speech or something, but I would think that that would be the main workhorse for all those processes.
Which processes?
Almost anything that's grounded in your sort of sentient activities as a conscious agent, right? There doesn't have to be just one global, workspace or representational space, I suppose. But I assume that there is at least one that is sort of. I guess my point is, once you have that, and if it explains phenomenal consciousness as like higher order theories kind of say it does, then it could do a lot of the work that you would need. I don't see why you need like a separate, conceptual thought module or format somewhere else. But so then I have this problem of like, well, why can't you just consciously be aware of, this is a horse and this is not a horse and it's red. But I suspect that comes down to the fine-grained contents, that there are certain contents that even if you're aware of them, they just wouldn't, there's nothing it would be like, say, visually or auditorily or whatever to entertain those contents. Like not a horse, maybe I am aware of that in imagination, It's just that it doesn't appear to be anything in particular.
I mean, I'm not sure I'm 100% following, because maybe I'm too in the grip of a theory, as people say, but I sort of can make sense of what it is like to see not a horse. Sometimes that does make sense to me. Like, yeah, okay, am I seeing, is this not a horse? Yeah, I mean, sure. But I think so. There's different pictures you could have of this. I agree. And Alex, I'm not saying that that your view is wrong or that anything like that, but I think it's a different picture, because the kind of background picture that I'm thinking of is really influenced by my work with Joe and Joe Ledoux. And he has a very particular take on some of these things, and they've worked their way into my head. So that's not to say that they're right, but I think they do color the way I think about things a little bit. And so one of them is this idea that in the brain, what we basically have are two systems that are yoked together causally. And one of these is a system that's directed towards like the maintaining of the organism, basically. And the other is a higher cognitive system for modeling what's going on at that first order level, for control and for all kinds of various things. And maybe at that level, you don't have consciousness yet, but you have states which are in working memory and are globally broadcast. And so in the Ledoux model, you have this kind of this output, this stream which branches off. And one of the branches, tributaries, goes to reporting, and the other tributary goes to the basic module or area where the higher order representations are going to occur, where consciousness is going to result. And so the stream that's going to sort of eventuate into both those is not conscious, but it's this like very put together representation of the animal in its environment and what's useful for it, what's threatening to it, etc., which is used in guiding behavior. And then there's this output, which is part can be used for report, and then the other is inputting into this higher order inner awareness system or whatever. And so I do think that these are going to come apart, but there's not like a virtual workspace, so to speak, where the virtual subject is in there really controlling things or something like that. But instead, there's just this representation as though that's what's happening. And really what's going on at the other level is in communication with this intermediary in the global broadcast to global workspace, working memory thing. But really, that thing has super blind sight, so to speak. And if you took away the higher order inner awareness module, it would be a case of super blind sight. Then so that is, in a way, to deny what you're saying is that where all the action is in the higher order module. It's like all the action is elsewhere. The higher order module is just kind of painting this picture of you as the driver, so to speak. But I don't think that really is accurate. And that may be one of the ways in which this disagreement is manifesting.
Can I try to put Alex's point in a slightly different way?
Yeah.
I thought the point was some kind of dilemma where either you think that the higher order thoughts are basically just formulated in the language of thought. It's not modular, in which case it can do a lot of things, right? Because it's just the ordinary format in which we think. But you're going to get problems with compositionality. Why is it that we don't have disjunctions in perception? Why is it that you can't formulate I am in a state of hearing red, or I am in a state of seeing pressure on my skin? Those are not the things that obviously you can formulate those in the language of thought. You can think those thoughts because they're false. So you can think them.
I don't know. I've heard
the
red
module
before, man.
So that's one horn of the dilemma, and the other horn is if the view is not like that, if it's instead that you have a special module where you have something like a language of thought, but it has its own syntax, so to speak. It has its own grammar of experience, so to speak.
Yeah.
Then why do we have it? I mean, why would something like that have evolved, for example, given that we have this entirely new system with this hugely complex grammar. So why do we have it?
Yeah.
Is that, Alex? I mean, that's an interesting point I'd like to respond to, but does that capture what you're trying to say, Alex?
I would love for you to respond. I just wanted to quickly follow up and say that, well, I didn't articulate it so clearly as a dilemma, but it is something like that. And it just occurs to me that, like, insofar as there are arguments for, like, what is the conscious representational space for, there's this argument about chunking, for example, that you kind of need to get a compressed representation so that you can do useful things with it. And that compression is maybe related to consciousness, although that's not necessarily a simple story. But yeah, I think this question about what's the function of this thing, if it's sort of upstream from something, if there's a branch here into something that's this large useful workspace and this monitoring thing, I would think the monitoring thing would have to be useful in those various ways.
Yeah. So, and I like Matthias's way of putting it as a dilemma. But first of all, I do think that some of these are empirical claims. So I feel like I have had the experience of hearing read before. I've as a college student, accidentally ate some mushrooms on I found, let's say, and had some very strange experiences. And one of them included hearing colors. Absolutely. So I don't know if I mean, yes, there were some weird psychedelic experiences going on, but it doesn't seem so bizarre to me that someone could hear the color red. It's very loud and shrill, actually. Anyway, so the point is, I think that's an empirical claim, and whether you could have these kinds of combinations of, hearing the smell of vomit, I think that's an empirical claim. If you could produce that representation in the relevant higher order module or space, then the prediction is that if that combination could be produced, then that's what it would be like for you. So that absolutely is a prediction of the view that you could get some weird combinations given the elements that can be combined, the palette, so to speak. So that was kind of the question that you started off with, and that Alex has been following up with, is like, what is this? Is it just the ordinary palette of regular concepts, which I'm inclined to say no. But is it a specialized palette of these, the grammar of experience, which I kind of like that way of thinking of it, actually. That's where I'm more inclined to think, and which is what has always put me outside of the normal higher order camp, because those guys, I think, as I traditionally think of them, are very much, no, these are ordinary concepts, and they're just can become applied very quickly and automatically. But other than that, they're kind of normal, and that's always struck me as very strange. So now, why would such a system exist? I mean, that's a good question. I don't know, but it's an empirical claim, and I think that one answer is the kind of one that I think we might find in Joe's work, which is that the reason this system exists is because the causal interface between it and the lower order system is very useful for control, and so that to have this kind of modeling relationship, this non-conscious model, which is inputting things into this area where you start to experience things, can then feed back down into that non-conscious model, and there can be this two-way interaction between them, which is a way of controlling. So in that sense, you could give a little bit more back to the idea that this is a space where things are happening. On the other hand, it could simply be a spandrel, that you have this output of this stream that's going for a report, which is very useful and has functions. And then as a byproduct of that, it simply occurs as a matter of fact. So I'm kind of neutral on that question, but ultimately I see it as an empirical conjecture that there will be a kind of specialized system or module. I think of it as distributed, and probably the most likely. And this is something else maybe we can talk about, because when we get to the level of the brain, I think that the most likely outcome is that the things we're talking about are distributed over a large area of the cortex, not located in one. So the idea of a module shouldn't be associated with one particular area of the brain. Although I do think that particular areas of the cortex will be modular in some sense, but that they'll be kind of, the modular areas will be different components of the higher order representation. So maybe one area for like the seeing part, a different area for the eye part, and a separate area for the red part. So this is a possibility. I'm not sure how it's all going to shake out, but my ultimate commitment is to the empirical falsifiability of this view. And so if it did turn out to be empirically falsifiable, that'd be great. I'd be happy to move on. But I don't think that any kind of a priori, like, why did it arise that way? I'd be like, I don't know. So why are there redundant systems? Why is anything the way it is? I mean, things are weird. So I'm not as worried about those in principle objections as I am to, like, empirically, is there some reason to think this is or isn't the case?
I do. Oh, sorry. I had a natural follow-up to that, which is, I think, rethinking it, I feel like you have an answer in a way in the book. So the pointer contents, right? Your argument throughout is that they kind of grease the wheels, they facilitate, they maybe maintain the state longer than it would have been maintained otherwise, right?
Yeah.
That first order state. So there's your function. Now, whether that's points to this dual stream splitting view or what I was saying, I don't know, but like, it seems like one function of these higher order representations would be to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's not of this content though. So I was taking the objection was like, what role is there for this particular kind of content? What I think of as the intentional content. But you're right that I think that the higher order state, it has both kinds of content, and one of them is doing that role, but it's not producing any consciousness stuff. It's just doing that other thing. So I thought that the question was specifically about the consciousness produced, the phenomenally active content in my specialized language.
Can I focus an issue which seems to me to just have come up?
Yeah.
Which is, I want to separate out two issues. Let's take it as given that they're higher order representations of our first order states of the kind that Richard has in mind, maybe in the prefrontal cortex, separate from reporting. And now we might be interested in the functions of that system. Why do we need this higher order? What do they do for us? Even maybe it's a spandrel. And Matthias and Stephen Fleming have a paper coming out which addresses just this question, and I'm half convinced, and it's nice stuff, and to do with reality monitoring, and you need metacognitive states to control your behavioral dispositions in certain ways, and that's very good. That debate doesn't necessarily have anything to do with consciousness. I mean, I might be an eliminativist about consciousness or an illusionist, and I'm not interested in consciousness. I mean, I could still equally agree that these higher representations and worry about the evolutionary role and so on. So once we've decided all that, there's a further issue. Should we equate consciousness with this bunch of processes? And now I want to ask about the methodology of addressing that question, because you said, look, it's all empirical, right? But one empirical issue is what are the evolutionary functions of these higher order representations?
Yeah.
Empirical issue is, do conscious states coincide with these higher order representations? And I'm a bit curious about how, this is a standard issue, but it wasn't entirely obvious to me in the book how you are operationalizing that kind of philosophical question, which bits are conscious. It's obvious to me, reading Gauss's paper, how he was operationalizing that. And yes, and I wonder how far you're operationalizing it via access. I mean, the states that we can report are the ones that are conscious. I know you talk about the overflow stuff, but it wasn't clear to me that what you said about that took you away from that access operationalization.
Mm-hmm. So,
and then there's there are people who don't buy that. I mean, Ian Phillips, my colleagues, James Staziker, they think, being conscious is one thing, accessing it's completely different. And I wondered if you had any. Right, okay. Do you have argument? I mean, am I right about how you're operationalizing consciousness? Do you have arguments in favor of operationalizing it in that way?
Yeah, so I am very skeptical of operationalizing things in the way that standard higher order theorists do, like namely by appealing to the transitivity principle, because I think it does beg the question against people like Ian and James. I think they're great, and I really admire their work. And I do feel the pull, by the way, of kind of the argument that I think Ian is making, that perception is always conscious. And because that's a kind of folk idea, like it's what else, what are we talking about? Like, so I mean, there's more to it than that, but I mean, at least at the start, it seems like you can do some justice to that. So I don't want to say that higher order theories are committed to unconscious qualities, or that you have to really defend. I think maybe there aren't any unconscious mental qualities. Who knows? It's an empirical question. So on my view, you should never ever accept anything for any reason except that there are empirical reasons for accepting it. I'm kind of maybe almost verging on a radical about this kind of stuff. But so in particular, when it comes to this stuff about consciousness, the kinds of things that matter are closely associated with what Anna Ilseth has called the real problem of consciousness. Because science, in my view, is concerned with prediction and control and explanation, but primarily prediction and control. That's what science really cares about. Explanation, theorizing, sure. Prediction and control, though, are really the keys, and I think Anil really is good about focusing on that. So, can we predict what kind of experience you will have based on the neurological states that you're in? Can we modify those neurological states in some principled way and modify the experience that you have in a correspondingly principled way, such that I could say to you, if I change the neurological state in X, Y, and Z ways, your experience correspondingly would change in X, Y, and Z phenomenological ways. And if you could predict and control, if some theory of consciousness allowed you to have that level of control over someone's experience, not just randomly shoving an electrode in there and turning on the current to be like, oh, look, something happened, but making changes in what it's like for the person systematically based on your understanding of what the brain was doing, then I would say the theory that allows you to do that is the theory you should have the most credence in. It's the theory that you should think of as probably true. Now, if it also provides you an explanation for why that occurs, then that seals the deal, I would say. But so now, in that instance, I haven't said anything about access. What I've said is that.
But you're not really scratching my.
Yeah, no, I'm getting to it though. I'm getting to it. Yes, exactly. So I haven't said anything about access. All I've said is that if you want to accept a theory of consciousness, then you should look for, can you make predictions? Can you control what it's like for the person looking from the point of view of the theory?
Okay. I'm worried about how we count what's in the what it's like box and what's not. I mean, somebody who says, stuff at the back of my brain, it's like something for me. Some stuff in V1 is like something for me. My blood pressure level is like something for me. And so your theory is all wrong because it can't predict those experiences. What are you going to say to them?
Well, I'm going to say the question is whether can we hold all other things constant, change the thing that you pointed to, and modify the experience of the person. And blood pressure is not going to do the trick. We can hold.
No, I'm thinking of somebody who says the level of my blood pressure is an experience for me. It's not accessible, but that's part of what it's like for me.
Oh, I see. Okay. So
you're assuming that we know which are the experiences and which aren't.
Yes, exactly. No, I don't presume that. So what I started off saying is that if you want to accept a theory of consciousness, then you should opt for the one that allows you to successfully predict and control and explain the phenomenological features. So now we have, and I don't think you should. So I don't think you should start with these hard cases. So you start with the normal cases and you say, can you, in this instance, well, and if you have a theory that you have a high level of confidence in as a result of doing that, then you can ask it what it says about the hard cases, and it will tell you yes or no about the blood pressure, yes or no about the brainstem, yes or no about, whatever thing you're interested in. But you've got to work your way to get to those questions by first getting a what Kristen Andrews calls a secure theory of consciousness. And I think that that's an important first step in all of these questions for the science, the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, is to what I call, say, put aside the hard problem of consciousness and to address what I call the central challenge. The central challenge of consciousness science is to try to figure out which of these theories we have, these approaches are correct, because the first order theories say there's some kind of overflow, higher order theories deny. And so to answer those kind of questions, we need to know which of these theories is on the right track. To know which of the theories is on the right track, we've got to know which of the theories allows us to predict, explain, and control the phenomenological features that are manifest. And then we'll deal with the fringe cases about overflow and so forth. That's my approach to that.
The way I took David's point was that in many, many cases, you're going to end up needing some kind of theoretical commitment in order to interpret the evidence, in order to interpret what the empirical data tells you. And so it's not exactly clear how you get to this kind of, first step where you get a theory, where you start empirically validating a theory. That was a point that was made by Deservine a while ago.
Yeah.
That you need theory in order to interpret the data, and so it's very unclear how you can falsify the theory that says V1 is always conscious, even in people who deny seeing or anything like that. The way we
well, it wouldn't be that hard if you could hold. I mean, so in the book, I invent a very handy device, which would be nice if someone would actually make. I called it the brain clamp. And the brain clamp would allow you to take any part of the brain and clamp its activity at a certain level of electrical neurochemical activity and allow you to mess with other parts of it while you held a certain part constant. And I do think that that's an important component of what's going on, is that we have to, and that's why in my quest, we haven't really talked about this a lot, but in my quest to think about how to empirically validate higher order theories, I've really been trying to find a case where you have the first order states are the same, and yet conscious experience is different. And of course, whether you can find such a case is very difficult. It turns out it's not clear. And all of these issues that we are now discussing come up about how do you interpret the data and which theory are you using and I think that there's just no clean answer, because that's just how science works. But nonetheless, even in all of that mess, you can still say, okay, if you're a first order theorist, then in this particular case where you're looking straight ahead at the thing right in front of you, there should be some activity in your brain which you say is corresponding to that. And if I tweaked it in this way, then suddenly you should say, or the thing out there should go burn. And if you can't do that, then the theory's wrong. And if the higher order theory says, no, there's a different state that's got this different content, and if you tweaked it, then the experience would go rant. Those are the things that we need to be looking for, how to control, because it's only then that you're going to get causal inferences that are secure, when you are able to intervene in the system in a systematic way and see the corresponding changes. And at that point, I think that all these hard cases kind of, get sorted out. And if you look at, this, I guess maybe I'm too much of a pragmatist, but I think if you look at the history of even water and H2O, and Ha-Seok Chang has this really great book, Is Water H2O, which I recommend to everyone. But if you look at the history of this stuff, you just find out that there were always diehards who denied that water was H2O and thought it was a simple And it's just that what they never got refuted, really, we got bored arguing with them, because the idea that there was a chemical composition fit with so much other stuff that we knew opened up so many new and interesting questions that led to so many new and interesting things that it just became kind of ridiculous to be like, yeah, but. And I just feel like that's what's going to happen with respect to these questions. But if you start all the way with the fringe cases, then it looks like you'll never make any progress. But if you start with the kind of regular everyday cases, focus on prediction, explanation, and control, what ordinary theories tell us about these particular cases, then I think you can baby step your way to eventually where someone has to like contort themselves into such a position that you just go, okay, and move on with your life. But I don't think science ever like conclusively demonstrates that the other side is wrong. It just, it's not useful to think in those terms anymore.
Can I?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very abstract, and you might be right, but can we try and show how it's going to work in a concrete case, a standard kind of issue for higher order theories?
Yes.
Like I don't know, I'm walking down the street and I'm thinking very hard about Gödel's theorem, and
As one does.
next corner, and I think, oh, did I park my car there? And then I recall something I saw while I was thinking very hard about Gödel's theorem, that my car was on that corner. Now, I mean, first pass, you might think you didn't have a higher representation of that state earlier on. Okay, on your view, it's not that the later higher representation makes the earlier state conscious. Would be a nasty consequence, and you don't have it. Yeah. But it's only later on you become conscious, as it happens, of that earlier state. But it's not obvious that that's. I mean, some people might think that's a refutation of your view, that you were conscious as you walked past of the car. How else could you recall it to mind? And it's not obvious this is a hard case. Many people would say it's an easy case that refutes your view.
Yeah, I love easy cases that refute my view. Then I can go home early. But this doesn't refute my view, sadly. So
I'm curious to see what you're going to say, because I wasn't exactly clear from the book what line you're going to take on this case.
Yeah, I sort of, by the way, in my defense, I kind of was taught early on that the way one becomes a famous philosopher is by making things not exactly clear in the book. Just kidding. No. But yes, I realize there's a lot more. This could have been a much longer book, but I was under a deadline and I had to get it done before I had to die teaching. Anyway, so I appreciate all of these very thoughtful challenges. But my view would be that you're walking down the street, there's the first order states are causal. I mean, you're not bumping into the car. You're not crashing into its mirror, the little rear side view mirror or something like that. So there's some sense in which you're aware that the car is there, because I define awareness in terms of informational sensitivity, and simply would say that you are aware and would allow such claims as that Roomba is aware in this sense. Self-driving cars are aware in this sense. And some people want to challenge me on that, but I don't, whatever. So I think of awareness as just informational sensitivity, where what that means is you're in states that allow you to be responsive to the thing in the environment. So in some sense, then, if your eyes landed on it and you didn't crash into it, then I would say that you were in mental states that allow you to keep track of it, and in some sense you were aware of it. Now, I would even say that probably you were higher order aware of it, in the sense that you were having a conscious experience as of stuff around you. If you're also thinking to yourself about Gödel's theorem, as one does when one walks down the street. I actually had this exact experience, but I walked directly into the turnstile of a New York subway, and I didn't swipe my thing. I just forgot it was there and fully doubled over it and almost like flipped. So I had a little bit more of a, I would say I was not aware. See, that I'm not informationally responsive to the thing. It was very embarrassing. Anyway, so the point though is that I would say, yeah, you could be higher order representing that very detailed first order state, which maybe was in a sense painting the picture mental qualities of the car over there. but you could be aware of it just as, oh, there's stuff on the street. And so what you're consciously experiencing is thinking about Gödel's theorem while navigating stuff on the street. And then that would sort of be what it's like from your impressionistic point of view, because I don't picture yourself as in a black void. Although I did recently speak with someone who told me they sort of do when they're lost in thought, everything else disappear. And I was like, okay, so maybe for you, you're not sort of painting this vague picture. But the way it works for me is that I have a general vague sense that the stuff was there. And then later I can now direct my sort of phenomenal attention back and be, oh yeah, right, that car, or whatever it was in your example, which I was aware of previously, but just not as that specific thing. But it was there in my awareness, which allowed the pointer content to keep that state around long enough for me to then go back and go, oh yeah, it's got this aspect of the content, and describe that part of it. So I do think that these the pointer contents, the role that they play, is allowing the sort of the picture painted by the first order states to be present for you to come back to in the way that you described, which is how I explain things like change blindness and Sperling type cases.
So I'm very happy that you can tell a story that's consistent with, but it's not like you've refuted the alternative view that's just some flat-footed first order account of consciousness.
Absolutely.
And it's not, and you give a lot of empirical data that bear on different kinds of higher order theories. Do you want to be relational? Do you want to be non-relational? And so on. Wasn't clear to me you gave empirical data that bore against flat-footed first order theories.
Yeah, you're right. I agree. I'm not even interested in that question in the book, because it seems to me that that's a lot of that work has been done. And I was really concerned with like how neglected the higher order sort of area of the space was. And in particular, people were saying like, why are you focused on all these different kinds of higher order theories? And my response was like, but why are you guys focused on all these different kinds of first order theories? Because global workspace theory, Ties, Andretsky style representation, those are all first order theories. There's different kinds of first order theories. And so we needed, I think, to fill out the space over here. And so I wasn't trying to argue and object against first order theories. I was simply trying to say, if you were trying to test specifically higher order theories, what would you be looking for? And so now, as a corollary of that, you could kind of get at first order theories by saying, well, could you find these or not? So I do think that it's an argument against first order theories if you could find first order states that were matched in content, but where there was phenomenological differences. And that's what I hoped, when I first heard Hakwan, when he came to New York way back in 2009, 2010, was presenting his work on subjective inflation. I was like, that's what we're talking about. The first order states are the same, and yet there's a difference in what it's like for you. Turns out maybe it's not exactly as easy as, as that, but that's why I was interested in that kind of work, because that's what I think, that's the argument against the first order theory, which I would want to press. Is that you could have that same state, but a phenomenological difference. And in a way, that's kind of already the argument which I think people like Ned are already pressing in his work on, from the attention literature from Marissa Carrasco, that basically he's like the same first order state, but phenomenological difference. So I think of myself as trying to press a similar kind of argument, but from the higher order point of view, where we're trying to say that what's different in your phenomenology is better tracked by the difference in these things we think of as higher order. And that was, so anyway, that's been a theme of my work for a long time, going all the way back, is that's the important way to get at these two different theories.
Nice, that's helpful. Thanks.
Just to quickly follow up on that, where you were describing the prediction and control criterion as the main thing you're interested in,
yeah,
it occurred to me that it's difficult to find the type of prediction and control that uniquely bears on theories of consciousness without begging questions, right? Because if you think there could be unconscious representations and perceptions everywhere, then you could have a very elegant, elaborate theory of prediction and control of contents, but those contents may or may not be conscious. So the thing that you're talking about right now about holding the first order content fixed and varying something else seems to be sort of where the game is at.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's kind of like it's an empirical question, I guess, whether that kind of thing happens. And if it does, then it certainly speaks towards higher order theories, I think, or at least against first order theories.
Yeah, that's the argument, that as I fully, in the fullness of it, as I think of it. Yes, exactly. So, but look, I'm not against first order theories. I mean, you know, my background, when I came, just by anecdote, you know, when I came to the Graduate Center as a starry-eyed graduate student way back in 2003, I was basically an identity theorist, influenced by Ned's work, and thought that you know, mental qualities were just neurochemical states of the brain, and maybe something like what David's view is now. That's in, you know, we've talked about this in previous instances of the podcast that I've had him on. But I think, you know, that kind of view, that what I think of as a first order view, is something that I'm very influenced by, and I don't think of myself as like rejecting it. I simply think of myself as exploring an alternative view, because I divide my credences amongst these. I mean, basically, as I say in the first chapter of the book, I think that if you are a physicalist or someone who's friendly to physicalism, then what that entails is that there's some structural or functional property which is going to be identical or closely associated with consciousness. And so by structural, what I mean is like an identity, like some you know, identity between just the neurochemical state of the brain and the conscious quality. And by functional, what I mean is like something like the thing I described in the book, or something like Tyne-Tversky, something like that. But one of these two camps has got to be the case. So I don't see myself as trying to argue against the other view. I just try to see myself as saying, look, there's kind of a mess here. And if you just came and if you're interested in a higher order theory, and if you were a scientist and you just came and you talked to people like David Rosenthal and these other sorts of people, you would get a very, very weird sort of intuition about where you would look to find the things that they were talking about. And it would be not the place that you should look to find the things that they were talking about, because they set up the picture in this very confusing Quinean way, which makes sense to philosophers, but does not really make sense to scientists who are not so much caring about all these ins and outs of the conceptual analysis of the various, you know, conscious state and blah, blah, blah. So I thought, no, what we're really looking for is, can you find the higher order state, and can you mess with it and change what it's like for the person while keeping everything else the same? And can you keep that higher order state the same and mess with the first order states and change what it's like for the person? And those are the real issues in this area, it seems to me. And it's important to set it up in such a way that it becomes clear that those are the real issues. And that's my only goal, was to be like, okay, can we clear this space a little bit so that we can see what the actual debate between the two camps is, in such a way that any kind of empirical evidence would count. Because like what you find instead is people say, oh, higher order thoughts. Oh yeah, no, babies are conscious, so that can't be right. And you're like, oh my God, so much more complicated than that. So I was just more interested in bringing out how complicated all this was, rather than presenting an argument against like the other side, so to speak. But to make clear like what it would look like.
Just to bring up a case that's maybe the reverse of what David was suggesting. How do you deal with the case of Anton syndrome? So people with Anton think they can see, and they're going to sometimes describe objects, but they're blind. So the first case is described by Seneca, actually, where Seneca says, "You'll never believe this. This woman, she is totally blind. She's going to bump into objects and so on and so forth. However, she's convinced she can see." And he says she complains that her apartments are too dark, but she thinks she sees.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's a case where it seems like you have your higher order states are, obviously she represents herself as seeing. She thinks she sees. But by all accounts, it would seem like she's blind. So I was worried that on your theory, you'd get the verdict that she actually has conscious visual experiences, which is one possibility.
Yeah, no, that is the verdict. So I don't. It depends on whether she. So I do think you can have higher order beliefs or higher order thoughts or higher order judgments or some other kind of cognitive state that would be more closely associated with traditional metacognition, which I would see as distinct from these higher order representations. So I do think you can think about your own, so you can have false beliefs and judgments, and then so I don't want to deny that those exist, and that as a separate category, I think you can consciously think about your own. So that's a wrinkle to add on top of this, but which involves introspection. I think it's an open possibility that the person in Anton syndrome is actually having a conscious experience, as they say. I think that's an open empirical possibility that's not refuted by the fact that they don't have any visual awareness of the external environment. And oftentimes, and I remember as a graduate student bringing this up and people just kind of laughing at me and saying, well, but they can't see, they're blind, they bump into stuff, so they obviously don't having an experience. I was like, but you're kind of assuming that the part that does the driving around, so to speak, and allows them not to bump into stuff is also the part that results in them experiencing stuff. But if those are separate, then it becomes a real empirical possibility that this person is correct about their experience, even though, correct about phenomenologically what's manifest, even though they're incorrect about what's in their mental life. So they're hallucinating, so to speak, a mental life that isn't there. But that nonetheless is the way their mental life appears to them phenomenologically. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm not saying even that you should believe it. I'm just saying it is a possibility that I wouldn't want to reject right out of hand automatically, simply because they have some damage to the first order visual states that don't allow them to become aware in the typical way of the environment. So I think it's a possibility. Now, to find out what was going on, you would have to then, what areas of the brain are active? Are they the areas that we think are relevant for just ordinary thinking, or are they the areas relevant to what we think of as conscious experience? And we don't know the answer to that, because first we'd have to sort through some of the things that we've been talking about in this discussion so far before we could address it, which is why I don't think we're going to make progress by starting with these hard cases. I think the hard cases are where we're going to end. And what we want to start with are the typical cases where you just have the person sitting there and you are adjusting what it's like to be them because of your knowledge of neurochemically what's happening.
Not just one thing, which is that in some of these cases, the patients eventually discover that they are blind. And so in principle, you could ask them, did you actually have visual hallucinations?
Yeah.
Or do you think you've been blind the whole time? I don't remember exactly. So recently, Dobby Ranef and I and a few others had a paper on those kinds of cases.
Exactly.
It's actually quite frequent that they discover that they're blind at some point. It's not like, at least to the best of my knowledge, they don't report, oh, actually I had hallucinations, and now I don't have the hallucinations, and so I think, and now I think I'm blind. But maybe just to
yeah, but I wasn't committed to them actually having that. I just said it's a possibility, and I wouldn't reject it automatically simply because they lack the relevant first order states.
But you got nice room to maneuver here, Richard, because there is something puzzling about Anton syndrome. What is going on in these people's heads that make them think that they can see?
Yeah.
One story you might tell is that they have a higher order representation as of, I'm seeing lots of details without representing the details being filled in, the kind of stuff you want when I was going down the street. And that might be quite a nice explanation of.
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. And that is what I think is the relevant possibility, although it's an empirical possibility. So I would want to say, first of all, you would want to look sort of, like the kinds of stuff that we're doing right now, which I don't think is going to solve any of these big questions, but like the kind of thing we're doing with this Templeton grant. I'm working with two different groups that are looking at these kinds of questions, and I don't think we're going to like conclusively answer these questions, but we're going to. I don't think science ever does, although you tell granting agencies that it does because they're got different. But real science progresses incrementally. And I do think we are going to tiptoe our way up to the answer, and we are standing tantalizingly on the brink of being able to say some importantly interesting things. But I think that like for example, what I predict, that you have these kind of abstract, vague, generic, but also possibly very rich or detailed higher order representations floating around. There should be some evidence of them. You should be able to find them empirically, and you should be able to manipulate them empirically. So I'm, really worried about whether we can find them. And, I know results always should be taken with a grain of salt. That's why it's not no real super worry here. But also I'm worried about these kind of, stimulating studies from the prefrontal cortex that Matthias seems more sanguine about these kind of things maybe than I am, where they don't really find the kind of things you might naively predict in the prefrontal cortex when you just stick an electrode in there and stimulate it. Well, you might naively expect just some random distortion of conscious experience. If those were the areas where so this is an argument that Benji Kozak makes, which I think, is a pretty good argument actually, that if there were these relevant areas there and you just started screwing around with them, you just started hammering away and twisting knobs and turning dials, you don't know what you're doing at all, then you would expect some really random stuff to happen, just like distortions. I mean, that's what happens when we stick an electrode in the fusiform face area. People go, whoa, your nose just went blank, blank. And it's like something dramatic happens. We can't control it. We don't know how to predict this activity gives you that, but we can say, aha, something is happening. So I do think that those are the kinds of things that you would want to be able to do to the Anton syndrome person as well, and find out, okay, so are they hallucinating? Are they not hallucinating? Do they have a merely false belief? Because and I am going to want to distinguish between the kinds of because I also accept cognitive phenomenology. So I think that there is something that it's like to have a conscious thought, and maybe in some versions of Anton syndrome, that's all that's happening, is they're having these weird conscious beliefs. But also maybe what's happening is they're having this weird conscious experience as a vague general stuff. And then later, anyway, so I do think all of these are open questions. But the one thing I want to guard against is that sometimes neuroscientists say this to you, they'll be like, oh, but that's not a visual part of the brain. And so therefore they can't be experiencing anything as a result of activity there. And I want to suggest that, well, we don't really know what the visual parts of the brain are, if by what you mean is the parts that produce visual phenomenology. It's still an open question what the visual parts of the brain are there. And so Anton syndrome, I think, brings up questions like that and brings them to the forefront.
Yeah, can I interject for a second?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting case, and I kind of one possibility is that people who have always been blind might have they might think that they're seeing because their first person access to what seeing is, well, there isn't any, right? So whatever concept they've arrived at about seeing, it meets their criteria for that. Then when they find out more, like that they're blind and they see evidence for that, then they revise their beliefs. So I think this idea of and this actually kind of also points to the flexibility in a way of these higher order representations that you're positing, that they can kind of coarse grain in these different ways. But this raises one of the issues I wanted to bring up. I think there's a good chance he'll get into this in later sessions with Jake and stuff, so I don't want to take too much time on it. But first of all, I didn't get a chance to say this. I really appreciate the book as a long-term higher order thought, person, because I think the way you've sort of re-articulated things around this relational, non-relational axis is really useful. And also your kind of investigation and critique of the role of the transitivity principle in grounding all this stuff. So I was thinking a bit about this after reading your book and during, and I personally find the transitivity principle appealing. I also find the HTTP, the
horror theory transitivity principle,
appealing as well. And I was trying to think about how these are related, and it almost seems to me that the transitivity principle, and maybe traditional higher order theory in general, is sort of like a more naive theory. Mm-hmm. It's like the conscious state, right? Like seeing red. Oh, I'm seeing red. The conscious state is the one that you are aware of being in. that's what you might think at first. But then it's almost like taking a step back to some kind of sense data, not specifically, right? But like just taking things like Cartesian skepticism and the possibility of indirect perception. Once you've internalized that, then you revise your belief and say, well, okay, really, I'm not sure that I'm seeing red. I just know that I'm having some kind of internal representation as of that. And so I'm not sure that we need to come down one way or the other on like which is the conscious state. This opens up onto another question. So I think you made the point that like the way that traditional higher order theories are framed can be confusing to non-philosophers, and I think that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
And two main reasons for that. One is the sort of Quinean purely functional role semantics that's assumed by like David Rosenthal and Josh Weisberg and people like that, and me. And that's one source of confusion. And then another is, I think, this pinning everything on the transitivity principle, which is divisive, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So.
And I Alex, I agree about that. The transitivity principle. So I do think it's I wouldn't say naive, but it does in a way that I think both David and maybe Matthias even as well, that they accept just at face value the way things seem. So if you call that naive, I don't know, but it's like it just seems like I'm conscious of these. What I'm conscious of in introspection is like these things, and in the same instance, the transparency intuition is like the other aspect of that naivete in a way, where they're like, no, I'm not aware of anything mental. I'm aware of something out there, and there's no sense in which I'm aware of something mental. So the sense in which I reject the transitivity principle is not that I think it's a terrible idea. It's just that I don't think that it defines what a higher order theory is, because there are higher order theories that reject it. So therefore, it can't be the defining feature of higher order theories. And I don't think you need to believe in unconscious qualities to be a higher order theorist. I think Joe's idea is that no fear was ever unconscious. But he's still a higher order theorist because he doesn't think those first order states should be called fear or something like that. So I don't know. That's a respectable view. So I'm very cautious about the transitivity principle and the idea that, Rocco told me that he thinks it's a priori, that it can't possibly be false. I just think this is absurd. Like, I mean, you can't just win these arguments by telling other people that they're stupid. I'm sorry. You just can't do that. So if you tell someone, look, if you don't see how this is a priori and tell that every conscious experience is one you're conscious of, then you're like, oh, wow. I just don't think that's a good way to proceed. I have no offense to Rocco, but I just think it's a terrible argument. And maybe some offense to him because it is a terrible argument. But anyway, so, and I think that Rosenthal is very dangerously close to having a similar kind of view, where instead of saying it's a priori, he just says it's folk psychologically bedrock in a sense or something like that. And I don't think that's true either. I think there's some intuitive pull to it. Maybe some people like it, but go down the street and meet those guys. They don't like it. So you can't set the whole thing up like, and Josh is someone I think guilty of this as well. He says the way the debate is set up is explain the transitivity principle. Explain what makes a state a conscious state when it wasn't conscious before. And that whole way of setting the debate up, I think, begs the question against this other side. But at the same time, I don't think that higher order theories are committed to that, because if you go back to and you read John Locke, he's not talking that way. David Armstrong didn't talk that way. Locke probably wasn't a higher order theorist in the way we think of it. At least some scholars have told me, stop talking this way about Locke, please. And I was like, okay. So whatever Locke said, it suggests to us this view that it's inner awareness. And if you think awareness involves the transitivity principle, then great, that's a theory of awareness, sure. But it's not the only theory of awareness that's around. And what higher order theories are committed to is just that inner awareness is a central component of the explanation of phenomenal consciousness. And so the way I think of the transitivity principle is we sort of say, well, it's implementing that. It's having a state which is a state of inner awareness, which is what phenomenal consciousness is. And then, so phenomenal consciousness and state consciousness as these things, I think they're separate things. state consciousness can be defined theoretically as the state of which you are aware. Great. But that's a very substantial further claim to go on and say that's the phenomenally conscious state, as opposed to some other state. So I do think that these are important issues.
But I mean, if you wanted to go into something else, please do.
No,
but
I just wanted to see if you had any follow-up to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you're switching frame of reference from the person who is sort of in the experience and sort of, I would say naively, I don't mean that in a bad way, but naively sort of ascribing to themselves the seeing of red or whatever. And yeah, you can define the conscious state as the state of which that they take themselves consciously to be in there. But then, you can also shift to the frame of the neuroscientific or cognitive scientists who is trying to explain this. And then I think I can see why you'd want to say that the higher order representation is the conscious state. I was thinking a bit about this and trying to understand David Rosenthal's response to you about this. And I think there's some wiggle room in so I think the argument goes something like let's take the cases of missing first order content or missing first order state. So the argument is, which I think Uriah has some version of, but it's well, in those cases, obviously the conscious, there is an episode of consciousness, there's some conscious state. It can't be the first order state, so therefore it must be the higher order state. Is that how you see it as well?
Well, I think that if you're a traditional non-relational higher order theorist, then you're going to say the first order state is the conscious state still. So David does say, I think, that the first order state is the conscious state, even in that case, which you can make sense of. But I find that you have to, first of all, be a very devout Quine,
right.
Which, I don't want to be. My background is more, like I said, I'm more Kripke, Fodor inspired than I am in terms of semantics. And especially in terms of the way the mental semantics is going to work. So, and that's what the relational, non-relational thing. I mean, in the old days when I was a graduate student, I call these K-hots and Q-hots. Kripke higher order thoughts and Quinean higher order thoughts, because I thought there was some kind of causal demonstrative tie between the higher order state and the first order state. And the Quinean view was just a purely descriptional. So I still kind of have that picture. It's just now it's in terms of the relational, non-relational distinction. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, just to finish that thought. So I think the wiggle room might be that you could say that the horror, the high order representation, is like a state in virtue of which you're conscious, and there might still be a gap between that and the conscious state as you naively think of it, right? So there's a state, it's a state that is a brain, an actual, a brain state of your brain, of your mind, to be less committal about it, in virtue of which you're having a conscious experience.
Yeah.
And that could be a slightly different concept from, or different extension anyway, from,
the state that is the conscious state that you're aware of.
Yeah. But what I think is nice is so in my own thinking about the transitivity principle, I started drifting more towards, I think you quote David Rosenthal at some point, with a more nuanced version of it that says something like conscious states are I'm going to butcher it, but a conscious state is conscious with respect to those properties that are represented essentially, right?
Yeah.
I think once you shift to that more fine-grained view, the reference to states kind of naturally drops out. You just start to think of it more in, I think the end point of this is kind of your version of the transitivity principle, which is, well, what you are conscious of phenomenally is a matter of how you represent your own mind to yourself. And I think that naturally sort of the reference to state consciousness isn't as important in that framing.
I mean, I agree. And I tell you that when I first started this, I was going around saying, this is like, when I first met these two different camps, it's like, okay, so one side, Ned Block, is dividing the space into phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. And then you go into Rosenthal's class and he's like, no, there's creature consciousness and state consciousness. And I was like, but where's the phenomenal consciousness? And he's like, that's not a real thing. And I was like, oh. But since everyone thinks it's a real thing, like where would it go in this picture? And so I started trying to say, well, if you were going to put it in this picture, or if you were going to translate your view into something that Ned would understand, this is how you would say it. And David Rosenthal was like, no, that's manifestly not true at all. And I was like, okay, but then it's what I say. so I did start this journey by trying to just sort of think of where you would, how could you fit phenomenal consciousness, which I think of as the most central, real, and important part of the mind that I'm, confronted with. And I'm not an illusionist. I'm very much against illusionism. I just think that we don't want to play any games with phenomena. We want to explain it. We want to understand it. So where does it fit in this picture? And when you're looking at this division between like this inner awareness and the state of which you are aware, it seems to me that the phenomenally conscious state is simply the one which, when you are in it, there's something that it's like for you to be in it. And by that definition, it's the higher order state. It's not the first order state. Now, why? Because that state couldn't be absent. So it's not the state which, when it occurs, there's something that it's like for you to be in that state. It's the higher order state, which when it occurs, there's something that it's like for you to be in that state. Now, what it's like for you to be in that state is like having the first order state occur. That's where the confusion, that's where everyone gets tripped up. And that's why I think, anyway, so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You were about to say something.
So that you just made is akin to like the move that Descartes makes when you realize that, the things that I'm seeing, it's at a different level, but the things that I'm seeing in the world, well, I might just be having this experience and the content might be false. You've just sort of made that move at the level of theorizing about.
I mean, I do see this following the same kind of pattern as debates in philosophy of perception, and that's what inspired my relational, non-relational language, was that in perception, you have the debate between relational, naive realism, direct realism, relationalism nowadays, and representationalism. And I sort of saw the same kind of debate playing out in the higher order camps, where there were some people who thought, no, it's just this relation to the thing down there. It's just like you're aware of it directly in some weird direct way. And then there's this other side that says, no, it's this representation of what's going on down there. And that's, I think, they're not identically the same. But what's interesting is that even like, and then you talk to people like Susanna Schellenberg, and you can see, well, there's even kind of like, and Farid Monsieur, there's another guy, I think, in this area. There are versions of like my view where you have the pointer and the conceptual and the combination. That's kind of now becoming talked about at the perceptual level. So I think you get analogs of all of these debates, because really those perception guys are talking about consciousness. They just don't want to say so. But a lot of these debates are similar. So I do think that my way of thinking was trying to distinguish what's distinctive about the representational view from the relational view, which says that there's kind of just this primitive awareness of the thing down there, the way it is. That's a very strange and mysterious view, which is why I agree with you, David, that, naive realism is a very strange and mysterious view. And I say the same thing about naive realism about the first order states, which is why that chapter 7 of my book, I try to develop this. Well, the mental qualities would have to be this inner awareness independent property, which is very strange, because if it has the property independently of inner awareness, then it is that way all the time. And pointing at it or becoming innerly aware of it is like a very, doesn't add anything to it in a way that can change its phenomenological character. So yeah, I do find all those sorts of views very, very, very strange. And the response that I get from Rosenthal is that, well, no, the state which there's something that it's like for you to be in is the first order state, even when it's absent. There's something that it's like for you to be in that state. And then you're like, what are you talking about? And he's like, oh, it just means that you represent yourself as being in that state. And it's like, okay, so if that's your conceptual analysis of what it means to be in a mental state that's conscious, is just to have this other state represent, then that's fine. But that's a very different thing than this relational picture which is what people usually take the view that he presents, and which is why I think it's also very confusing, because he does present it as though it's a relational view. And in some sense, what I say ultimately is, yeah, you know why? Because the higher order state represents you as being in a relation. So it seems like there's a relation, but there isn't. It's just a representation of one.
Do you want to go on next? I want to come back to the question of how you're thinking about representationalism and how it's supposed to give an account of what its likeness. But it occurred to me we could have a little kind of interlude here. I want to ask an obvious baby question that I don't think you touch on in the book, which it's an implication of your view, I take it, that animals and babies are not conscious. And
No.
many, okay, and right, okay, let's see it, because as you know, many people find that a unattractive consequence of higher order theories, and
Yeah.
so where do you go on? I mean, you know, therefore we can treat animals and babies how we wish. We don't have to take their interests into account, and so on.
Yeah.
So how do you go?
I think this is a complex issue. I originally had a chapter in the book on robots, babies, and animals. And it became kind of like unmanageable because the issues are very complex, and it could be a separate book actually, but I don't have time to write any books. So there probably will never be a book. But it is, I do have a couple of papers, which maybe someday I'll write. But anyway, so I think that we want to distinguish methodological claims about the nature of science from kind of metaphysical claims about what properties there are or aren't out there in the world. And I do think it's a very unsettled question methodologically about what counts as good evidence that non-human animals are conscious. But I don't think that there's like a real serious open question about whether non-human animals are conscious. And I think it's obvious that they are, that dogs and cows and you know, maybe there's a question about where and how far down the line, but I think there's some pretty obvious cases where it's just clear what the answer should be. But how do you establish it scientifically? That's a different question. So I do think that we because of this issue about reports and the methodology stuff that we've been talking about for a long time, that just starting with, I think that there's one big unresolved question in the science of consciousness, which is how powerful is the unconscious mind? I don't think we know the power, the extent that the unconscious mind can do things independently of consciousness. I think it's an open empirical question. So any given behavior that a non-human animal produces, you could always say, yeah, but could a human do that unconsciously? Maybe yes. So is this evidence for consciousness? Maybe no. That doesn't mean the animal's not conscious. It just means that we don't know what counts as good evidence outside of the realm of normal humans. So I would say that's one question. But it's not the same question as, are the animals conscious? I just think it's beyond obvious that squirrels are conscious, that they feel pain and see things. Is it like ours? No. So, you know, Joe Ledoux once said to me, no rat has ever felt fear. And I was like, my jaw dropped down and I fell out of my chair. And I was like, what are you talking about? But what he really meant was like our experience of fear is very distinctive based on, you know, colored by our kind of mind we have, the kind of concepts we use, kind of language we have. And animals don't have any of that. They're going to have some response to a threatening environment, which is probably conscious and feels a certain way, but is very different than ours. So I take that. But I still think there's some commonality. I would call it fear. I don't know if Joe would, but I would say they probably do. Anyway, so I'm getting distracted. So that's the methodological question is one. But the question of, can my theory account for the possibility that the answer should be yes in those methodological cases? There, I think unequivocally the answer is yes. So I predict that these animals are conscious and that they can have higher order states and that they will have higher representations that represent themselves as seeing, you know, or being in threats. And so and infants as well, I think there are some innate concepts. I think that even maybe prenatally, it's a possibility that I wouldn't rule out that there's some kind of very primitive higher order representation, just very inchoate, not filled in, so I take all that stuff very seriously. I think they're empirical issues. but I don't think there's anything about what I think of as a concept or what I think of as a mental state or what I think of as an awareness, which would preclude a priori those states being had by those kinds of entities. I vehemently deny that there is such an implication. Now, of course, you could have a view like mine and have that view. I think David Rosenthal actually is committed to the view that empirically, because of his view of concepts and his denial that there are innate concepts, that there is the period of a child's life within the first 6 months at least, if not longer, where they cannot have the relevant higher order states. And so infants in that range, on his view, I think it's an empirical necessity that those things don't have conscious experience. My view denies that. I think they have some innate concepts. I think that they're going to be having higher order representations extremely early on because of these innate concepts. So I would predict that newborns are conscious, or within this 6 months range at least, but it probably prenatally. So yeah, and animals too. Yeah.
So say more about the higher order representations in infants and animals. I'm trying to think what. So there's debates about how widespread is metacognition. Nick Shea thinks that prediction reward error is already metacognition.
Yeah.
You can do experiments on monkeys, getting them to bet in different ways depending on how conscious they are. Matthias has a paper appealing to that, I think. But say more about what kinds of higher order representations you have in infants and animals. I mean, it's not obvious that the two I've mentioned especially lend themselves to thoughts of the form, I am now having a first order state with such and such content.
Yeah, I don't think that really you do have, that anyone has such states. So I think.
Sorry, I thought that was your account of conscious states. They're mental states that represent other states as having a certain satisfaction condition.
Yes.
Right, and you have to show me that animals and infants have mental states like that.
Yeah, exactly. But you described it in a very complex way that I would say probably doesn't apply to the infants. So for example, one way that this kind of becomes a concrete issue is when I think about Ned's argument that infants don't have conscious color experience because they don't seem to employ concepts. In certain empirical cases, you can show that it seems like they're using concepts about what shape an object has to form expectations, but not using concept about what color an object has to form. So if something comes out and changes from red to green, they don't really care. Something changes from square to circle, they do care, stuff like that. So Ned argues they are conscious of the color, but they don't have the concepts. So they don't have, they have conscious color experience without concepts. And so my response is to say, well, on the kind of view that I develop, they could have a conscious experience of seeing, even if they didn't have any concepts of colors, because they might describe themselves, the higher state, as simply seeing, a dark object, in which case the red and the green thing are going to be similar. They might describe it with using some other visual property, which is common between the two things, and not describe it as seeing red versus seeing green, because they don't have those concepts. So they can't show up in the higher order state. There's evidence that they can learn them, and then they do maybe show up. Okay, so I think that in this particular case, what the kind of higher order state they have would be some vague sense of, I am seeing a dark square.
So you agree that they don't experience colors consciously?
I think you have to be careful here, because what I think is that they don't have colors that are phenomenologically manifest as part of their experience. Yes. So I think that's compatible with the argument, because the argument is, oh, well, they don't have these color concepts, but they do have a conscious experience. So therefore, higher order theories are wrong. Cognitive theories are wrong, even more generally, but higher order theories specifically. And I want to say, no, they do have a conscious experience of the color. It's just not, they don't experience it as a color. But the state which is conscious is the state which the first order quality of red or green is there, and they're simply aware of it in a way that leaves out that it's red or green. But that's the state of which they are aware, so it is the conscious state in that general sense. But what it's like for them is like seeing a dark object, or like seeing a, I don't know about dark, but bright, or you could use something that's not.
Do the dogs persuade me that dogs have concepts of mental states? That seems surprising to me.
Why?
Well, I'm all right. All you need to do is show me that they have some behavioral, ecological, cognitive need for such representations, but it's not obvious to me at all that they do.
Do you live with dogs?
Yeah, my son.
Well, then it should. I mean, I don't know.
He's not a very bright dog, but I mean, he's not very bright when it comes to food and finding his way around.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
It never occurred to me that he might be bright enough to think about his own mental states.
I don't think it's an intelligence thing that is going to allow, because that's why I don't think that. So this is not a sophisticated ability that you like you're implying that's thinking about one's mental states. That's why I reject the higher order thought way of approaching things, because I don't really think that's what you're doing. You're not thinking about your mental states. That's very sophisticated. That's something I can do. I don't think my dog is sitting around thinking about his mental states either. But that doesn't mean he isn't higher order represented.
He's got a mental representation of his mental states. That's obvious to me.
I think that, well, I don't know why. Well, I don't know why it has to be obvious that that's the case in order for it to be the case.
Okay, put it the other way around. Many people think that it clearly doesn't. Dogs can't do theory of mind abilities, not even when you use the kind of surprise methodology. They show no evidence of sensitivity to mental states.
Well, I don't know about that. Dogs are a special case. I mean, dogs are one of the only animals that you can point and they'll look at what you're pointing to, not at your finger. So that is a sensitivity to where your attention is directed. And so maybe that's unique amongst dogs, but I do think that the kinds of things, we don't want to equate kind of higher cognitive functions with higher order representations, because the kinds of things that I'm talking about are not involved in these metacognitive things. So I don't really think of higher order representation as specifically related to metacognition. That's an idea that comes from Hakuan. And he thinks that that's an empirical discovery, that we have reason to believe empirically the brain machinery devoted to metacognition overlaps with the higher order stuff. That's an empirical discovery according to him. I kind of wonder if that is really an empirical discovery. I don't know if there's some evidence for that. I don't know if it's true. So I don't really think of these as like metacognition in that way. I think of them as higher order representations. And so if the dog is consciously seeing red or consciously smelling a smell, and if it's acting like it's consciously smelling a smell, then that will be because it has a conscious experience of smelling, in which case there will be a higher representation of itself as having a smell experience. But that's an empirical prediction. That's not something you could see from the behavior of the dog in normal cases, because everyone agrees about what's going to happen there. This isn't a prediction about what you find inside.
Okay. I'm not 100% skeptical. I mean, Matthias's BBS paper, you argue that as soon as organisms can do response outcome model-based reasoning, they're going to need to be thinking about their representations, and that's a serious argument. And I'm not sure how good dogs are on that, but I should think they'd pass fine, actually. So yeah.
But, I mean, I would give up higher order theories before I started wondering if dogs are really conscious or not.
About kids, so at some point, is it they learn color concepts at 4?
Yeah.
Well, they become proficient with color concepts at that age. Yeah.
So at some point around that age, where they're able to think a lot of thoughts and talk a lot of talk, they'll get color concepts and they'll get color experiences,
They'll get public color concepts.
they'll get the phenomenology of color. Shouldn't they feel like surprised all of a sudden to have those whole new phenomenal qualities? I mean, if you look at videos of kids tasting lemon for the first time or things like this, they're very surprised, but you never see kids looking around like amazed of having all those phenomenal color qualities. Instead, what seems to be happening is that they just get a word or concept for something they already have.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Don't you think there's something weird with the fact that they're not, they don't seem surprised or don't mention it? That
well, I don't think that's happening at that age. So I'd be very surprised if I thought that a child had their first color experience at age 4. That would be sort of a bizarre.
Okay, so your view is that they first acquire the perceptual color concept that's used in higher order thoughts much earlier than they use
the public concept.
The public color concept, red, for example.
And I mean, in fact, the empirical work shows that if you train them, they can acquire it at 6 months. So you just have to show them basically that there's some function associated with the color. And, you know, colors are a bit weird because there is no real functionality associated with it. There's, you could say some things. And yes, red is a very ecologically significant color for humans for various reasons related to mating and various things. So
traffic lights as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you can say some things, but generally speaking, you know, colors are kind of causally isolated, and we focus on them a lot in discussions of consciousness. But it's a weird case actually to be focused on because of these reasons. So I do think that we have to be careful in that particular instance. And so if you teach them like that, for instance, that the red thing is a shovel and the green thing is a funnel. I mean, I'm making that up, but you know that, Brian. So it's got to be right. But anyway, so if you associate different functions with the colors, then they start forming these representations during working memory, keeping track of them using the color and so okay, did they acquire? So at what point do they start to notice that certain colors are relevant to these things, like red things are hot or cold blue things are cold? So I do think that they're going to start acquiring these concepts way before they're proficient with the public language concepts. And yeah, so I agree that that would be very surprising if they all of a sudden one day everything went from just being kind of shades of darkness and lightness to suddenly being colored in, and they were like, meh. That would, you know, that would be a very surprising result. But I don't think that's what's happening. I think that that's how much.
I think it's quite possible they don't see colors till quite late on. I mean, they wouldn't have to be surprised when they start seeing them. It might happen gradually, and the kind of thing you don't especially notice. But color vision, putting colors on surfaces with color constancy, it happens very late in the brain. Nobody's quite sure where it happens. It's very tied up with classifications.
Exactly.
And it's not the primary reason, if you ask me, why the brain uses chromatic information, why we have cones, why we have 3-color vision. It's because they're all the people who've got part of the late visual cortex knocked out, achromatopsics.
Yeah, cerebral achromatopsia.
They don't put colors. Everything's black and white and gray. They can see the edges that are chromatic edges and not lightness edges. But
well, there was one case though where it wasn't even black and white and gray. So you have to be careful to distinguish between retinal achromatopsia and cerebral achromatopsia. So if you just lack the rods and cones, if you just lack the cones but have the rods, then people see shades of gray. But if you have damage to V4, then they don't distinguish those either. So there's no color experience, not even shades of gray, which is even harder to wrap your mind around in a way.
Yeah.
But that's what they say.
And you're saying the cerebral achromatopsics, they can see 3-dimensional form, they can see shapes, but they don't want to say they're shades of gray. Well,
yes.
what do they say vis-a-vis colors, vis-a-vis shades?
Nothing.
It's not like that, they say. Yeah.
Yep.
That's interesting. I've written about this, but I never had that datum. And I want to think about that a bit. I mean, it's, yeah.
Yeah. So, Kathleen Akins makes a big deal out of this kind of stuff. If you've ever read it.
I should have a look.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So I think all of this stuff is very, very complicated, and I don't think we really know. So remember, I get painted. I'm defending this view. I'm not really a super in a way. I'm like, with friends like these, who needs enemies? Because I'm not super committed to this view being true. And if like my only contribution was like we can now see how it's false, then I'd be like, that's progress. Because I do think that at the beginning of this discussion, it's very unclear, like what would even count as falsifying the view, or even what would even count as challenging it, not even falsifying, just even challenging it or being relevant. So I think that way before you get to is it correct, you have to get to what even counts as being relevant, what counts as challenging, and it's very difficult to say what that is, especially given that I think things are very subtle here. Like, for example, that I think there's a pointer content. So I'm going to agree with the reality monitoring kind of people that there is a kind of reality monitoring aspect, but it's not the phenomenological aspect, according to me. It's going to be this other thing, which is keeping track of which things are real or imagined. It's in the conscious state, but it's phenomenally silent in the sense that it's not producing any part of your experience. And so that's a real prediction, I would say, of the difference between like my kind of view and the kind of reality monitoring view that Håkon and Matthias defend, which is that I think you can vary the pointer content point all the different ways you want, and it won't have any effect on what it's like to be you. It'll have an effect on your behavior, though. And you'll suddenly start pressing buttons saying that something is green when you're thinking, wait, but it seems red to me. And you're like, oh, that's weird. So that I think that those are the predictions. Whereas on their view, no, you change the pointer content, things are going to be flipping, from red, green to purple to orange or whatever. So those are the kind of predictions that I think we want to think about. Where can we find stuff like that? And it's a lot. That's already enough work for us. It's super hard to do that. So I think that, before we can even get to these grandiose questions, we should start with these more tractable questions about, at this level, can we have that level of control? Anyway, yeah. So, and if it came out that the answer was no, then I would happily be like, oh yeah, first order theories are great. I knew it all along. I just didn't have to write a book on them because there was already these other great books that were already written on them. But I wouldn't be like super worried, or like, my ego sense of self is not tied up into the correctness of this view. I just think that what it presents us with an interesting test case for, can we be serious about the science of consciousness? Because I feel like if we could be serious about the science of consciousness, we could resolve these kinds of questions. And then the science of consciousness would be sort of as serious as the science of attention, or the science of memory, or the science of motor control, which are not resolved areas, but are serious with the questions that are empirically addressable, theories that are empirically testable. And if consciousness science could reach that level, then I would say we succeeded in what we tried to do, by creating this area of a respectable normal working area of science. But if we can't address these issues, then it's going to be forever this fringe area where you can say whatever you want, and all the Philip Goffs in the world can say whatever they want, and all the David Chalmers can say whatever they want, and we can say whatever we want, and everyone says whatever they want, and then we just keep on saying it. In which case, I'd be sad. So I do see my goal as not trying to defend this theory, but trying to address this more general question of, can the science of consciousness be a serious thing? And by testing that, I think here's a test case that can resolve this issue. And so Liz Irvine, I think she's very pessimistic about these kind of questions. She thinks, no, it's a mess. And I think, no, actually, if you dust things off in the right way, you can see how it's just a regular question, like all the other questions in science, and we'll get step by step closer to a good answer.
Can we come back to the methodological issue that David was raising at the beginning? I think it's still going to be the case, even if you can manipulate suppose that we find higher order representations in prefrontal cortex, for example.
Yeah.
And suppose we can manipulate them. And lo and behold, people report, their experiences have changed. The first order theorists will say, well, they think their experiences have changed. Actually, that's a prediction of their view. Their view is not that we don't have higher order thoughts. Their view is that the higher order thoughts are just there for higher order thoughts, for reports and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Whereas, in the other, if you manipulate, if you keep the higher order thoughts the same and manipulate visual cortex, for example, they'll say, well, their experiences are changing, but they just don't know it. And so it seems to me that even if you know where those representations are in the brain, even if you can manipulate them, it's really not clear how to interpret the results. And the way I like to think about it, earlier you said at some point that we shouldn't assume the transitivity principle in order to get the methodology of consciousness research going.
Yeah.
But maybe a slightly weaker way of putting it is in terms of a charity principle, or principle of charity, namely that most of the time when people say they have an experience and you don't really have good reasons for thinking that what they're saying is false, then there you go, they do have that experience, or or it counts as evidence that they have that experience.
Yeah.
Or most of the time, if you're just sitting in a chair, I mean that's one of the responses we got in our for our BBS paper, that people were insisting that people sitting in a chair just paying attention, knowing everything there is to know, could still miss aspects of what they experience, even though their working memory capacities are not overloaded or anything like this.
Mm-hmm.
And here I think just applying some kind of charity principle tells us, well, the burden of proof is clearly on you. So even if it's not the transitivity principle, I think you can get you need to find some way of putting more weight on subjective reports than those other sources of evidence, because otherwise it's just entirely theory driven, and the way you interpret the evidence just depends on your theory, and we never make any progress. So what do you think of this way of thinking about things?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of me thinks that there's a sense in which you can't really know unless you have it done to yourself, in which case you would sort of know at that moment whether you were just having a thought or having an experience. Since I do sort of take my direct access to my own conscious experience as a kind of very serious thing.
But you would predict that you'd think you have the experience, even if you didn't.
Yes, but I could tell the difference.
But how? You would think...
Because one's thinking and one's experiencing.
Is the idea that in one case you'd have the thought that you're having the experience and another thought that you're not having the experience?
Yes, you would have the thought, I'm having the experience, and you would be like, but there's no experience there.
But I thought we were just thinking of manipulating only the higher order representation, not these other higher order representations.
Oh, you're imagining a special brain clamp case where you keep everything else the same? And you just manipulate the higher order representation. The one that I think is relevant, not the cognitive one.
Yeah.
Then,
well, the question is whether you can do this in order to determine whether it's relevant. And what I'm saying is that you really can't, because if you were to do this, you'd say, well, there you go, proof that the higher order thought changes what people experience.
right.
And Ned would say, well, there you go, proof that you can manipulate what people think, but it's unrelated to what they actually experience.
Yeah. But I don't really care about what me or Ned think, because we're just two people. And what I think...
No, it's just a way of how do we interpret cases like these? And the question is whether we can really learn all that much from them.
Right.
And it comes up in the kind of stimulation cases you were mentioning by Omri, Raka, and Ned, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
My view is that it can't really solve the issue precisely for that reason, that even if you had effects and people were reporting this or that, then the localist first order theorists would say, well, that's just manipulating their thoughts, not really what they experience.
Right, but if you were the person who that was being done to, you would know whether you had the change in experience or not.
Well, in all cases, I would think the same thought.
Yes, but you would know whether your experience was different or not in some more direct, not thought-related way by having the experience. Because there's a sense in which knowing is having in the sense of, so there's a sense in which when you have the experience, yeah, I think you have a direct kind of immediate, almost infallible access to it.
But if that knowing, I mean, maybe there is such a thing,
Yeah,
dissociates from your higher order representation of your experience,
well, I
then
think there's two different.
it's not going to get into the scientific discourse. I mean, maybe Ned will say, "Okay, I'll give you that I was aware of all the characters in the Sperling display. I knew that, but of course, it doesn't come into my awareness." I'm not sure that's the right term.
So first of all, I don't think. I mean, this is a good challenge, so I appreciate it. But I don't think that there's ever gonna be one experiment which will convince everybody. That'll never happen. There won't even be a suite of experiments that convinces everybody, because there always will be the David Rosenthal's who will never give up, and the Ned Blocks who they just refuse to admit they could all, because you can always adjust any part of your theory you want to accommodate any evidence you want. You can always do that. You can't ever get around it. So there can always be a way of saying, here's an interpretation of the data that accords with, you just have to give up certain things. So the question becomes at that point, over time, once you've had to give up enough stuff, is the position that you are left with still accounting for everything we know or not? And I just think that the answer is going to be, you're going to end up tied up in such knots that it's going to be like the water H2O thing, where it's like, yeah, people were saying like, oh, when you put the tube in the water and you put electricity through the tube and then out comes one hydrogen and out comes the other oxygen, that the hydrogen and oxygen were created in the tube as it you could say that. You could still say that to this day. But okay. It's just not interesting to say that. It's just so.
But we're not in disagreement here.
Yeah, okay.
Matthias said something rather weak. He said, in order to avoid the kind of methodological meltdown that you're just pointing to, you have to give some prima facie weight to reports of consciousness, subjective reports of consciousness, and I think that's clearly true. I mean, that then raises the question: what's the rationale for that prima facie weighting? If consciousness was by definition acts as consciousness, that would make it a conceptual matter. But maybe there's some other way of defending that prima facie weighting that doesn't so commit you. And
well, I wasn't denying that prima facie.
Interesting question. Exactly, what's the rationale for using this as, I mean, I said operationalized, using this as a working criterion for when something's conscious? Defeasible, perhaps it's defeasible, but the onus is on the people who want to defeat it.
Right.
And I wasn't trying to defeat it. I was trying to defend it, because I think that the justification for it is that we have a kind of immediate direct access to our conscious experience. So of course a report is a good way of knowing what's going on with the person, because who else has immediate direct access to their experience? The subject. So I think that that's exactly why you should have some prima facie, unless you have some reason to think otherwise, belief that what the subject reports is likely the case. I thought that the challenge that Matthias was raising was that if you want to manipulate the conscious experience of the person, but not manipulate their cognitive states, then you're going to end up in a case where they can't notice the difference, basically, that you might be making these changes where they can't report on them. But was that, I thought, maybe I'm misinterpreting what you were saying.
Yeah, it's the point is that it's very difficult to find clear cases in which the higher order states stay the same, but the first order states change, and vice versa. And I'm just worried that if the idea is that, okay, we go with subjective reports, at least prima facie, maybe it's defeasible and so on and so forth in some cases, that's going to essentially lead to cases where that's going to load the die in favor of the higher order theories in some sense, because in the cases in which you change the higher order states, of course you can change what people think they're experiencing, but first order theorists shouldn't deny that you can manipulate what people think they experience in such and such way.
Right, but so in a normal kind of unconstrained system of the brain, changing one is going to have causal effects on the other.
Right.
So if I were to change your higher order representations, therefore changing your conscious experience, that would have some effect on your ability to report on that later on, unless you were separating this connection which normally exists between that and the reportable access thing. So I do think that in a kind of in a semi-contradictory way, I think almost, that phenomenal consciousness is a kind of access, but that there can be unaccessed phenomenal consciousness because there are different kinds of access. And that inner awareness is one kind of access to your mind, and then reporting is another kind of access. So I do think that these come apart. But the only thing that we can do when we're studying the mind is to take an all things considered kind of approach, given what the person says and what background assumptions we have, how do we fit this all together? So that's roughly the mesh argument that comes from Ned, and I'm a big supporter of that strategy and approach. I just think that the overall mesh, we can kind of set them up so that we have two separate meshes, one a higher order mesh and a first order mesh. And then the question that we're trying to figure out is what would decide between the two. And I feel like a lot of times the challenges that you guys are presenting is there has to be some like one thing that decides between the two.
No, I don't believe it.
Okay, good. So instead what I think is we're just going to kind of add up slowly that one side just kind of has to say something that looks increasingly weird and not productive and doesn't lead us to interesting further insights or questions. And it's not clear which one that is yet. That's why we got to keep chipping away at it. But I don't think you're ever going to get really better than that. And it really probably, that's just the best you can do in most of these things. And it doesn't really bother me. You got to go, Matthias. Oh, I'm sorry. You got more important business.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I'll see you maybe in New York this summer.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate it.
Bye. See you.
Bye, Matthias.
Yeah, he has a Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness meeting. He's apparently a high-ranking member, so he'll go and sort all that out for us while we're finishing this up. But anyway, so yeah, we do have about 20 minutes left to wrap things up. So if you guys want to continue, that's fine. Otherwise,
did we? Well, actually, there's a burning thing I wanted to bring up before we end it. I was waiting until Matthias left because I knew I didn't want it to get cut off after 1 minute. So I think you've really done a service in this book of, as you intended, of like just advancing the debate, not so much weighing in on horror theory, although you do, but like just advancing the debate by trying to, this methodological point is important, but like we're just trying to build something that's useful and that people will, get all hands on deck trying to build something that's interesting. And I think this pointer / descriptive content, as I would frame it in my mind, that distinction and that construct is really interesting. And I feel like we have not explored that, and that's one of the things I wanted to get to. I did say also that I wanted to talk about like the purely non-relational view, but I think I don't want to like get into trying to defend Quineanism or holism. I don't think that's productive. But I think actually your specific mechanism of like there's phenomenally active content that's sort of descriptive, and then there's a pointer content that's not phenomenally active. That's very, it's already, I actually already want to write a paper on it. Although I'm not sure, yeah, we should talk about that, but I'm not sure that, I mean, background, I'm not sure if I see why it should be a form of representation, but let me get into that. It's because that is the pointer content.
Yeah.
But that's naively, I was thinking, well, is there such a thing as mispointing? I doubt it. But then a few paragraphs later,
I say there is.
this is a type of truth condition. It's very interesting. So I'd like to, I mean, I want to say a few more things, but I'd like to get your take on what that mispointing could amount to. But so one prediction that I think you make in the book effectively is you say that, like, well, first of all, phenomenal consciousness is a matter of the descriptive content. And second, you say that this greases the wheels of access, and maybe it sustains the state. So that means that the descriptive content or its vehicle or something has to have that causal power of sustaining the state, and that constrains your theories of what descriptive content is. You know.
Well, I don't say the descriptive content has that. I say the pointer content has that.
Oh, sorry, but what I mean is you're saying that you say that the descriptive content is what makes it phenomenally conscious, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But what makes it like grease the wheels of access is pointing.
No, I got it. But you're saying that, I think somewhere you say that, well, okay, but in order for the claim to be that phenomenal consciousness greases the wheels of access,
yes,
right? So I'm saying, swap in descriptive content of the appropriate sort for phenomenal consciousness, right? Then descriptive content of the appropriate sort must grease the wheels of access. I'm not arguing against the pointer thing here. What I'm saying is that
I understand what you mean.
Yeah, there's got to be an internal relationship almost, or maybe it's an empirical question how it works, but something about the descriptive content should do the greasing of the wheels, I would argue.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about this. I don't think we're gonna fully get into it now, but like, I think there are paradigms for understanding how the addressing mechanism would work, coming from connectionist models and such, that interact in really interesting ways with this idea, right? So one thing I wanted to bring up is the idea of content addressable memory.
Right.
So I think, I'm not sure what, like, I guess Hakwon and you developed this pointer idea, maybe somewhat independently. I don't know if.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I'm not sure.
He had this idea independently of me, and we had it separately. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure how he's thinking of it or how you're thinking of it, but it's I think if like understanding the models that connectionists and deep learning systems use is relevant for understanding the brain at all, I think one thing they've helped us develop is an understanding of how content addressable memory works. And that's just to say that, well, instead of an arbitrary symbolic pointer, if you want to retrieve something, you supply a part of the content. And that also means if you want, you can, so, there's questions about how transparent the content is to the shape of the vehicle. I think it's quite transparent. I think it's sort of an isomorphism story. But in any case, you could predict, I think, I'm not sure exactly how to articulate this yet, and this is why this is a paper, but I think you could predict that the descriptive content is going to be it's going to boil down to some sort of syntactic, in the broad sense, feature of the higher order representation. And we have mechanisms like comparing similarity based on like dot products between vectors, right? And this is how sort of content addressable memory would work. So I would predict that the descriptive content would almost like activate lower order representations that had a similar profile.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a good point, because I do say that there are different models of the pointer content that you could have, and that I'm not overly committed to there being. So I sort of view like Hakwon as having one model, and then Steve Fleming as having another model, and then maybe you're suggesting that there's even further alternative models. So I do think it's, and when I started this, I was thinking of pointer contents as causal historical, a la Kripke and Millikan. And even David. having some teleosemantic relationship to the first order states and having the role of representing because of that. So, and then I kind of gravitated to think of them as like D-that, demonstratives, complex demonstratives. I'm in D-that red state. And so I was open, and then I kind of gravitated to maybe they're higher order finsts, like fingers of instantiation. So I do think there's lots of different, and I still think higher order finsts are a good, and I know we have a great song, Finsticuffs, which in my mind was always about this. Anyway, but I do think that that's a model that you could have, which would involve, but the kind of naive picture that I use is HTML, where you just have an address. The kind of model you're suggesting sounds to me like a higher order quotation, where part of the content gets used as the representation of the first order state. And that's a different model of how those kinds of things might work. So I do think I'm open to all of these kinds of things. The only thing that I do say, and David, I see your hand. You don't. If you're trying to say something, just a second. I would say the thing that I want to insist on is that we have one state which is phenomenally conscious, because when it occurs, there's something that it's like for you to be in it. That state has two kinds of content, one which is descriptive, the other which is pointing down, but that is got to be part of the phenomenally conscious state, because on my view, it's kind of what determines who is aware, because you in effect represent, when you get to chapter 3, I fully come out and say, really what the content of the higher state is, whoever it is that is in the states at the following address is seeing red, and then you list the address. So that the pointer content has got to be part of the answer to the question, who is seeing this? And the answer is, it's whoever's in those states. So that the pointing is part of the answer to the question, who is it? So it's got to be in the conscious state, so to speak. And therefore, I would say it's the pointer content that's doing this work that you're describing, not the descriptive content. Although there is a different model where maybe it's part of the descriptive content that has it. But so I would say it's the conscious state which has to grease the wheels of access. And the conscious state is the one that has these two kinds of content, not the descriptive content. So that's how I would say the model I have is slightly different than the way you presented it. But anyway, sorry, David, you got to correct us in some way.
This is good, because I'm now going to come back to the first issue I raised about the representationalism and just how we're thinking about the metaphysics here. Okay. And I think it's very seductive to go wrong, and probably it doesn't matter unless you're a philosophical metaphysician. But so you're talking about the cognitive architecture involved here, pointers and descriptive contents. But Alex, if you noticed, kept on descriptive contents or vehicles, or there's an isomorphism between what's inside and what's outside, and we're just talking about the inside bit of the isomorphism, or the syntax. We're talking about syntax. And that's all good. That's what we should be talking about. And that's not the same as representation. And people aren't always careful about this, possibly because for neuroscience and science, we identify these internal syntactic things as the thing that represents redness or whatever. But the fact it represents redness is kind of irrelevant to its status inside the brain. We can think about it in a couple of ways. I mean, the fact it represents redness, it's a vehicle. The fact it represents redness is to do with what's outside and the outside world. I'm sounding like Frodo here, God forbid. Yeah. And that can't make any difference to how it acts causally inside. It also, a related thought, can't really make any difference to how it feels when you have that vehicle. I take it, I mean, people will disagree, but I take it that how it feels for you depends on what's going on inside your head. That this thing inside your head bears a certain relation to features of the world is neither here nor there to how it feels. Now, when we go up to the higher order representation, the same applies. I mean, it's the syntactic nature of the higher order representation, which I hope is what's going to make it conscious in the way you think the higher order representation is conscious. And the discussion you were having was consistent with what I'm saying, but I don't think what you write in the book is consistent with what I'm saying, because what you write in the book puts the conditions for consciousness all in terms of representation of worldly properties.
Mm-hmm.
And the worldly properties really aren't constitutionally part of what's causally and phenomenologically significant inside the head. It's just the way we refer to these things inside the head in everyday language, and in fact, when we're using convenient terminology for scientific purposes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot going on in what you're saying, and so let me first. I wonder if we maybe have slightly different meanings for the word representation, which is kind of what you were sort of saying in a sense, because I am coming from the more neuroscientific camp, and there is an interesting paper that just recently came out that was like about the different use of representation by Rosa Chow. Anyway, so when you say there are mental qualities that are not representational, and that they come to because your model. Now I'm just switching to talk about your model, David. You say they're like words in a sense, just like the word, red, R-E-D could stand for green, could stand for purple, could stand for anything. The fact that it represents red is kind of an accidental feature of those marks on the page. Intrinsically, they have nothing to do with the color. And in a way, the mental quality is like that. It's just the way it is, and that it has any relation to some worldly thing is an accidental feature of it. Okay, but when I hear stuff like that, I get very confused, because I start thinking if it's a mental quality, then it's got to be in some sense telling you how the world should be. And if the world wasn't like that, you'd be incorrect. And you're saying no, that's an accidental feature of it in a sense. But I just don't.
It's accidental, but it's still a feature. I mean, look, it's an accidental. You could say the same about the words on the page. I say Elvis Presley was once in Paris, right?
Yeah.
It's an accidental feature that those words have that truth condition, but they do have that truth condition. And if he wasn't ever in Paris, what you said would be false. I mean, it's not that's not there,
right?
But yeah, so the analogy stands good.
Yes, exactly. But it's that I don't know how the analogy works when you take it to the case of the mental quality, and then you want to say the same thing is the case. Because if the quality is the way that it is, then it's sort of going to be accurate when it reflects the way the world is. Otherwise, what is it? It's not a mental quality.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, it wouldn't be a mental quality if it didn't represent the world. I mean, look, there's two properties that I have when I have a certain activity in, let's say, V4. One is I house a certain neural vehicle in V4. That's true. Another property is I'm representing that the world the world in front of me has something red, real red in it, in virtue of housing this property. I've got the second property. I am representing the world to be red.
Right.
In virtue of housing this vehicle, which is correlated with redness, and we can tell it here semantic or causal or Kripkean or whatever story.
Right.
Okay. So, but we want to separate out those two properties, the vehicle property and the semantic property. And it's the vehicle property that's doing all the causation inside the head, and I hope is the one that's constituting the consciousness.
Right.
All on it.
But so that's one view, but the other view is that it's the vehicle property which is doing all the causal work, and it's a different thing that's doing the consciousness.
Well, that is a view,
yeah.
But it's a very weird view.
Well, thank you.
My kind of not so naturalist, naive realist, Oxfordy kind of friends have views like that. And it has a consequence that the conscious property is not something that has causes and effects in the brain.
Yeah, but if you're a higher order theorist like I am, then it's not. That objection doesn't really carry the weight that it does against your Oxford type friends, because the mental quality, on my view, has all the causal powers. It's just not the thing which is doing the consciousnessy stuff. It's the higher order representation which is doing that, and that is, fine.
The higher order representation doesn't have causal powers for you?
It need not.
The thing that's the conscious state doesn't have causal powers? I mean,
yeah, it's a possibility.
That is a view, but I'd be surprised to learn that you were happy with it. But
I am pretty happy with it.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, I think it's an open empirical question that's the case. And I described some causal powers that I think these higher order states have, but they're not going to be the ones that the mental qualities have. The mental qualities, the first order ones, are the ones largely in control of my behavior, of me walking around in the world and pressing buttons and pointing at things and such. But that could be done unconsciously, maybe, perhaps, without any experience. But there'll still be mental qualities there, the same things occurring.
Yeah, but these higher representatives, they're going to cause what you say, aren't they? They're going to...
they're going to cause some of the things I say, maybe.
Yeah,
but even there, yeah. So, but they're not going to be causing. So they're going to cause. I think when I introspect is largely where this comes. You start saying, "Oh, I'm really seeing red. I'm having experience of seeing red." But usually we're not reporting on that kind of stuff. We're talking about the world out there. There's a red thing over there, and
these obscure matters, and they don't matter too much. But let's just reflect on this issue. You could do the higher order, the whole story you're telling in the book, in terms of the vehicles of representation. That's one set of properties inside the brain.
Yeah.
And you could do it in terms of the semantic properties inside the brain, that these vehicles represent things outside the head.
Yeah.
And you might want to think about, wouldn't the whole story be happier if you just did it in terms of the vehicles?
Well, I think the whole story is the thesis that you can't do one without the other.
Okay.
I know you need to wrap this up, Richard, because you have another session coming up. But
well,
I just
got
want
lunch in between, yes. But
okay, all right. Well, then maybe I think that a question that kind of wraps some of what David was saying earlier and was saying now, and what we're all saying is like, well, so the view on the table does kind of turn on representing one's own mind.
Yeah.
So until we know what that is syntactically, I think this might be the only way we have to get at it. So it could be an epistemic situation, partly.
I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I'm happy with that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
But I agree, these are all pressing concerns. And I also want to be conciliatory and say that I share a lot of David's concerns about representationalism. And when I first got into philosophy, way back when, I was, like I said, I was on the side of Ned Block. I saw myself as arguing against representationalists. And I was thinking, representationalism has got to be wrong because there's mental qualities and that's what consciousness is. But I just think that's one possible view. But there's this other possible view as well. And that I don't think these armchair considerations are really going to sort out which is which. But again, I agree, it's all very complicated. All right, I'll give you guys the last word. Any final words from you guys?
I'm all done. That was a lot of fun.
Great. I'm going to follow up. I'm going to write a paper, Richard. I'll send it to you.
I'll be happy with that. All right, thank you. I'll just end the stream. Stay on for 1 second. I'll say bye off air. All right, we're free. That was a lot of fun. That was a good discussion. You guys are really, really great comments.
Thank you. And you've got how many more hours?
6 more.
Amazing. I really respect this.
Just awesome. Getting started today. No, this was a good start. This was a good. I think we touched on a lot of interesting and important stuff.
Okay. Nice to meet you, Alex.
Yeah, good to see you.
I'm going to go and shoot and do some work now.
Okay. I'll be in touch later. Bye, guys.
All right. Bye. See you.